This is basically going to be our outline for today. And just a quick note, this workshop is being recording and can be rewatched by the end of the day on Monday after some quick editing of downtime on our YouTube page, where we post the recordings of all of our past workshops. If you go to cbwcd.org/YouTube, that will take you right there. Also, I'm going to save out all of these slides as a PDF that can be downloaded. And again, that will be posted by the end of the day on Monday as well. And you'll be able to download that at cbwcd.org/presentations. We always put the download link to the most recent one up at the top, so that'll be right up at the top next week. And so here's how we're going to break down this amorphous process called design. I'm going to start with just some general advice, thoughts, and perspectives, because designing a landscape is quite different than other things that most people have done in their lives. So we'll just stick with that. And then we'll jump into that in just a moment. And then we'll break down kind of the key elements of landscape design for residential spaces. We'll talk about spaces for people, spaces that connect the different parts of your landscape or with the house in the landscape. We'll talk about spaces for plants and choosing plants. We'll talk about spaces for wildlife, and we'll talk about spaces for water. And in reality, those are not distinct things. And in fact, in most residential landscapes, we don't have the room to have all of those completely separate, nor would we want to. And so part of the interesting part of design is assembling all of those, so where spaces will end up doing multiple things and connect really gracefully. And so from talking about those individual sorts of functions, then we'll talk about bringing them all together with a design process. Following that, we will do an in-depth home landscape design example, and then we'll talk briefly about next steps before we conclude. And so this will be do-it-yourself landscape design, crash course for creatives and the rest of us. So in this example, very typical of people who I work with, down to bare dirt, wondering where to go from here. So the first question is, where do we even start? And the big answer, one of the big ideas of the day, is we don't start here. We don't start at the nursery, and we don't even start at a really good local specialty nursery. We always start with our goals. And just a quick note for those of you who have joined us for our Landscape Transformation Basics workshop, there will be some overlap in some of this stuff, but don't worry if you've seen this part before. We go way deeper into the design. There's going to be mostly new content. So where we start is not with plants that we're excited about. We don't start with pretty flowers. We start our landscape with goals. And so this is the list of goals from the clients that I worked with that small dirt backyard that you just saw a picture of. They were actually the most difficult clients I ever had to work with in some ways, because they were my parents. And so that's always an interesting negotiation when you're trying to help people that you love who aren't used to necessarily seeing you in that same professional context that other people that you've been used to working with do. And so the goals that my dad had were actually quite simple for their backyard renovation. It was whatever makes your mom happy. But my mom had a pretty extensive list of goals for that small backyard. She wanted a comfortable place to sit and read, a place that felt relaxing, a place that would have the sound of water to dampen the noise of all the leaf blowers and string trimmers going on in the neighborhood when all the other lawns were being maintained every day. Something that would be relatively simple for them to maintain, something that would hide the less than attractive cinder block wall spanning around the edge of the whole backyard without spending a lot of money, something that would attract birds. It would look nice. In there, a space to grow some vegetables, and cram all of that in while making a small space feel bigger. And we can do all of that, but only through an intentional design process, not by hitting the nursery and getting plants that we're excited about. And so we're going to talk some about the plant selection part later on, and I'll connect you, for those of you in California, with our couple of our favorite resources for that. But really, this is going to focus on the basic design principles. Not so much, although we'll talk about plants to the plant selection. And we have a number of other workshops on our YouTube page that are really specifically focused on plants for this region. And so we're going to spend the time today focused on the design, and you can pair that with the more plant-specific content in our other online recorded workshops, and then you'll really be well on your way. And so this is the backyard that we are looking at. Lawn already removed. For those of you who are needing to remove a lawn and do your best to make sure that the lawn doesn't want to grow right back after you do your new planting, we have a whole other 3-hour workshop about that, going through multiple different techniques with lots of tips and hints. And that's our Removing Your Lawn the Right Way workshop, again, available at our YouTube page. So after thinking through and working out a design, this is plant layout day, where you can see we're working with just very simple things. Don't need to get a professional survey out for a residential project. A couple of wood stakes from the hardware store. This is just like a little flag on a little metal stake, and then just some strapping material that I happen to have, that green. And we just use that with the stake and then tying it and pulling it out, using a measuring tape to get the right length to make our concentric circles where the water feature would be, where the edge of the path is going to be. And then we ended up deciding to provide a sense of unity for this space. We'd lay out kind of a grassy, meadowy area with just some flowering perennial accents. And then while this was growing in, we just tucked in a few succulents right along the path as well for some visual interest. Planting things relatively small, mostly from 1 gallon or even 4-inch pots. And then some of the shrubs you can sometimes, and other things, sometimes you can only find in 5-gallon pots. So that's okay too, but mostly planting small and laying things out. And so when you lay things out on your site, just keeping it simple and affordable. So I'm a big fan of those white lines are just an old bag of flour, kind of sprinkling it out. If you have long kind of winding curves, you can lay a hose out in the sun for a few hours and then get that how you like it, and then put some flags or stakes or flour along it, and then always take a step back and see if that's exactly what you were going for. It's easy to change it up during this process, but hard to change it up after things have already gone in. And most people, even professional designers, are going to be making some slight tweaks and changes on the site as things go in, because you always notice more. So this is April 2015, right after planting. You can see the water feature hasn't gone in yet. We buried a kind of little vault that came from the landscape supply store that's going to kind of be the reservoir of the water. But putting this project in over a number of weekends as we had time. And at this point in time, most people think, oh my God, should have gotten way bigger plants. It's never going to grow in. It's going to take forever. But hesitate, because from April, this is October of the same year, 6 months later. And we have a year-round growing season in Southern California, but in most cases, some plants grow slowly, but it's amazing if you choose the right plant that's going to be happy in the garden, how quickly things will start to grow in. So if we had gone back and got way more plants, 6 months later, things would have been way overgrown. So it's a process of researching and knowing your plants and laying them out and having some confidence that things will get going. So here we go. And in this small space, we have the sound of water from this recirculating water feature made out of a large pot. A lot of local like ceramic specialty supply places these days will also sell kits or even do the work, extra drilling themselves, to convert like a large pot into a fountain for you. So that's often an option. Here's the bench that shipped flat and we assembled at home from a catalog. And here's the place to sit and read. The large shrubs, which we pruned up as small trees to provide just a little bit of shade. Didn't really have room to have a huge canopy tree right here in this yard without putting it right in the middle and taking up the whole yard, but that was just enough to kind of set the space back a little bit. And here, this space is, I don't know, probably no more than 13, 14 feet wide through here. But by using the feature in the middle, separating the space, this is from the bench to the main patio, creating a sense of separation in a small yard, which in fact has the impact of making it feel a little bit bigger. It's one of the design tricks that can be used. This yard isn't big enough to have whole like separate rooms with hedges or anything like that, but just creating this separate space with the feature is sometimes enough. Down at the edge of the yard, one raised garden bed for vegetables, which provides quite a bit of greens in the wintertime. And then looking back towards an old lemon tree, which was one of the 2 trees that was able to remain, and one of the few things other than lawn growing in the backyard when we started. So this is September of the next year. The bearded irises, very tough Mediterranean plant, starting to show their thing. And with habitat in many urban areas, it truly is, if you build it, they will come. So this isn't even a particularly habitat-focused garden. However, just by providing different structure, a different kind of matrix in the urban landscape, and especially by water, that's enough to get falcon coming by, visiting, and taking a break and taking a drink. And so in this simple kind of meadowy matrix, certain times of year, the bearded irises will be the thing blooming. And this is later in the late spring, early summer. We have Australian kangaroo paws and color from South African red hot poker. Different Mediterranean plants, very well adapted to this yard, which is in Van Nuys, California, kind of inland Los Angeles, and does very well. And then they just kind of fade to the back. And so that's later in the year. And then earlier in April, this is April 2019, at 4 years old, you see it's kind of more purples and bluish almost tones from the lavenders and the bearded irises. And at 4 years, you can start to see really how the design has grown in. One of the things that we often see where people get excited about plants but don't really focus on design is that by 4 years, gardens that have been overplanted or the plants aren't really in the place where they're perfectly adapted to the amount of sunlight they're getting, or maybe crammed too close together, is that those gardens look amazing at 6 months. But by the time you get to year 3 or 4, they tend to be overgrown and very difficult to maintain, where a garden that has really taken into account design, has selected the plants carefully to work well for the space they're going to physically fit in the space, whether it's a tree, a shrub, or a grouping of grasses or perennials. Then by the time you get to year 3 or 4, most of the open soil is covered up. You've kind of gotten through dealing with most of the weeds, and the maintenance starts to get just a little bit of maintenance starts to get a little bit easier, as opposed to the opposite if you're not careful with design, where it almost feels time for a whole garden renovation after 3 years if the design isn't thoughtful. And so you can see also in any design, it's never perfect. So you can see how well the creeping fig vine is doing on the back wall right behind the bench, which is nice because that's the place where people sit the most. But you can see it's taken longer to grow in along this open area. Wasn't really a big concern for my parents, and so they weren't spending a lot of time really trying to train it up. Sometimes it doesn't need any training at all and just goes, but over time it's continuing to fill in. And that has worked very well in the areas where it's taken, and it's slowly filling in. And it was very inexpensive to plant from a number of 1-gallon plants. Does take some shearing and some maintenance, but really has improved the whole look of the edge of the yard. And again, it's all about the right plant, right place, because creeping fig is aggressive. And so we needed something aggressive to cover that cinder block wall, but in other cases might not be the right plant. So thinking through that design, and we'll get into that quite a bit more. And so just one last image from spring of 2019 with the garden starting to grow in and my cousin playing in the backyard. So that is the landscape we designed for that particular yard based on that particular set of goals. And so a big question that I have for you is, what is your vision of a perfect garden or landscape for you? Because what's perfect for you is going to be very different than what's perfect for anybody else. And you might not know what that is yet. Hopefully you'll have more ideas by the time we get through the workshop today. But that's something to really be thinking about. That's the biggest pre-design question is what do you want for yourself? What do you want for your garden? And most simply put, design, as we're going to talk about it today, is a tool to help you get there. You don't need to be creative. You can be, but it's not essential. You don't need to be kind of a brilliant artistic type to do quite good landscape design. You don't need to be able to draw. I can't draw. Got a little bit better when I was practicing during grad school, but I don't use it as much anymore. And I draw kind of like a little kid. So don't worry if you're not artistic or you can't draw. And you don't need to actually know that much. You need to learn a little bit. You need to think things through logically, and then do a little bit of research about what's going to work for your local area. And those resources are available for pretty much everywhere these days. And the internet has been an incredible tool. Even the amount of information that's available compared to like 15 years ago when I was really getting started thinking about this stuff full time. It's incredible what's available to you if you then have the context of knowing where you want to go with the design. So it's not just a bunch of random information. Once you know how you're kind of making sense of it, know what you want to find out, then you can use all of those great resources available and know how they're going to fit in your plan for creating your design. And so today is basically going to be presenting a system today to help you out. It's not the only way to think about landscape design, but it's something that I've been working on for a number of years, really trying to empower people who are not full-time designers or full-time landscapers to feel confident in thinking through a design for their space. I like this quote from Henry David Thoreau. What is the use of a house if you haven't got a tolerable planet to put it on? And here in Southern California, that has been very relevant over the last number of years as we're starting to think through what we need out of our residential landscapes in the year 2020, 2021, really starting more in like 2015-ish. A lot of people started tearing out their lawns, which is great in terms of resources. But things like this started going in quite often, where it's wall-to-wall gravel and a few succulents. And in the right situation with the right planting, gravel mulch even could be fine. But these do not create the kinds of yards that we want to spend time in, the kinds of communities where we're going to be out in our front yards talking to our neighbors. And in addition to that, these yards without any plant cover, trees or shrubs over any of this gravel just absorb heat all day and then re-radiate it out at night. So it's going to be surprisingly hot even in this driveway at nighttime in the summer or standing here because of all of that heat. It solves a problem of water resources, but it creates a whole host of other problems in its wake. And so this is not what I'm encouraging people to do, even though I work in water conservation. Landscapes take up a lot of space in Southern California, even in our urban areas. I mean, outside of like downtown Los Angeles, if you look at most of Southern California in an aerial photograph, there's actually a surprising amount of green space, trees, lawns, a lot of it. And for a long time, especially for front yards, the main question has really been, does it fit in with the neighbors? So one of the advantages of all of these landscapes starting to change, even though it's still the minority, is that even in kind of the most conservative looking of neighborhoods, there's now a variety of different looks that are accepted in neighborhoods, as long as what's going in looks good. And that's great. It's very often, even in high-end neighborhoods now, that the lawn will come out and some sort of very nice looking landscape will go in as a house is getting ready to be sold as a value added. And so the key thing is thinking through what it will look like, but it doesn't need to just be lawn and roses anymore. But beyond that, we really have an opportunity for a new way to look at our landscapes. And I think we should demand more from them than just what do they look like. And we should ask, what do they do for us? There are significant parts of most of the property that someone will have. And if it's small, that maybe even makes it even more precious. And so we can expect a lot more from our landscapes than just being nice things to look at. And we'll talk through some of those as we go on. So where do we start? You should know this by now. Again, we don't start here. So one example of where we might start is in whatever your local wild area is. So this is the San Gabriel Mountains in Southern California. And don't get me wrong, I don't want my home landscape to look exactly like this. Not by any means. But there are some things to think about. What are the different types of ecosystems in your local landscape? Are there places where there are plants and ecosystems that grow naturally, adapted to the soils, the climate, the rain, and just feel like really good places to be? And for this case in Southern California, I mean, a lot of people think, well, we live in a desert in Los Angeles. We should have gravel and a few cactus, and that's how it's supposed to be. And that's really not the case. So anywhere in Southern California on the coastal side of the San Gabriel Mountains, so where I work in my service area in San Bernardino County through Los Angeles, going farther north and south from there, we live in a Mediterranean climate. And we have things like oak woodlands. Even the chaparral is pretty well covered with vegetation. I find a lot of inspiration in one of the remnant grassland savanna areas, Santa Rosa Plateau, which much more of Southern California used to be like, and beautiful plants that grow here. So if you're into a desert landscape in our area, the plants are well adapted and you can do that, but that's not the only choice. And so just to get a little bit theoretical, just for a moment, how do our ecosystems in our natural areas create these beautiful, inspiring places to be and just evolve that way without anybody designing them? Well, the answer to that is complicated, but one important concept is that there are different plants and species that fill all of the different niches, which are, a niche is the interaction of all the species within a member of its community. And so that's plants. And when you go farther, that's animals and microorganisms. But as we think about it in our home landscapes, how it applies to us thinking about plants and spaces that are going to be comfortable to be in. We don't need to get too technical, but did you notice that when you looked at our local landscape area, it's not a few plants here and there and a sea of wood chips or gravel. It's a layering of plants, sometimes trees, but shrubs and lower grasses and perennials. There's a lushness and a density to it, even though there are plants that are adapted to our long, hot, dry summers. And so even just that seed of an idea gives us an idea of how to successfully do the planting design for our regions of landscapes in most situations. And I think that's a really important thing to reflect on. It's not just a surface to cover and some things to stick in the ground. And so I'd encourage you to look at landscapes, wild ones, also look at other gardens that you like and don't like, and think about how the designers of those gardens set them up. And so you can go as literal as creating a landscape that kind of replicates things that you like from a wild landscape. I've done that in some projects. Here's an example of a young kind of growing in picnic area that we created with boulders and mostly coast life oak trees, really emulating an oak woodland. Another planting that really emulates our local chaparral community. But for most of our landscapes, it's not going to be that literal, but can be something that really informs a lot of the richness of our thought of our landscapes, gives us something that's not random to kind of ground it in. So let's take a step back from that kind of more theoretical stuff and just kind of talk design. What is design? Well, one thing design is not, is it's not a purple flowering plant over there next to a yellowing flower plant over here. It's much wider and it's much more useful, and only worry about colors if you want to. When I do landscape design, I'll think about seasonality of flowers, because I really want to make sure that there's going to be something blooming for pollinators all throughout the year, and we can do that in Southern California. But I don't worry about color. I find that if I do a nice landscape design, the flower colors are going to take care of themselves. If you want to get into the flower color, do that. But that's not necessarily what we're talking about when we talk about design. Design doesn't require starting over or having a blank slate. It can be just as well used for incremental improvements or problem solving. So this is the landscape that we are going to use as an example when we do the full design example later on. This is the backyard of a place that my partner and I used to rent. And it was basically dirt, as seen here, rapidly turned into weeds and some tightly packed fruit trees. And the landlord basically said, do what you want, but don't cut down the fruit trees. And so that's what we worked with. So that's just fine. Design is a system at the end of the day. You don't need to be creative, or you don't need to be a genius. Design's about setting your goals, making a plan, and then taking those steps to accomplish your goals. And so before we jump into individual kind of areas and thinking through that next part of the workshop, there's a few notes to help you with landscape design and garden design to help set you up for success. This is a crucial one for people who are just getting into gardens, landscape, thinking about their yards in a different way for the first time. Gardens are not furniture. Garden design or landscape design is different than redesigning the decor in your living room, where if you choose a couch very carefully, and as long as the dog or the cat don't scratch it, it will last there unchanged for a very long time. And in fact, the first day after it's delivered is probably the best it's ever going to look. Gardens and landscapes are living systems. And so you set them in motion with a vision of what it's going to look like. And if you do things well with a little bit of luck, after a few years, it will turn into something that exceeds the vision that you had. You'll be surprised, but delighted. Design is a way to achieve a functional, maintainable living system in your landscape that's a pleasure to be in, a pleasure to interact with, and ideally a pleasure to care for. You as the designer of a landscape are never fully in control. It's a wild world, and things change, and every so often plants die. Even if you're a horticultural genius, if you plant a whole landscape, a few plants aren't going to make it. That's just how it works. So don't beat up on yourself if that happens. Design is best a continual process where you'll have your initial design, and hopefully most of it will be very successful. But over time, something will die, or you'll get an idea for something you want to change. And that's great. And then your garden can evolve over time. And those end up often being the gardens that are loved the most, are the most pleasurable to be in, where there's that little sense of you don't need to be preoccupied with it all the time, but design is kind of a continual process. And it's not necessarily something that gets set up one year and then you do nothing other than cut back the shrubs. And then 10 years later, you rip it all out and do it again. If that's what you want to do, I guess you can. But most homeowners find that it's kind of tweaking things over time and really kind of refining it as you go is going to give you the best result. It's also the best way to kind of protect your financial investment as well. So I encourage you to go into it with a sense of curiosity, willingness to learn, and an understanding that no landscape is perfect, All landscapes evolve over time and experience disturbances. Don't fall for those perfect landscapes that you see in magazines and compare your landscapes to those. Those are pretty much almost always photographed in springtime or the peak time of the year for how that garden is going to look. And a garden that's been around for a few years, I mean, the people involved with that garden know second half of April is going to be the time to go photograph it. And the professional photographer will come, and all of those gardens have something dying or dead in them also. They're just not going to take the picture of that and show it to you. So don't worry too much. Get inspiration maybe from beautiful gardens and photographs, but don't expect your garden to look like that year round all of the time in every part of your garden. So who are we designing for? Well, at the end of it, I kind of like to think that we're designing for people and the planet. So what kind of people exactly? Who? Are there going to be kid people in your garden? Those that will have considerations, especially if it's little kids who like to tromp here and there. Design for that instead of worrying about keeping them out of areas. Elderly people. I definitely know that the first time I pushed my grandfather in a wheelchair down a gravel path in a garden that I designed, I learned a lot very quickly about how gravel paths need to be designed, if that needs to be wheelchair accessible. Not too deep with the gravel, for sure. Dog people, cat people, you can see in the lower right, for my home landscapes, two of the most important clients are the cats that we have. They spend hours and hours every day studying our landscapes for the lizards and birds that it attracts. And so views into our garden for the different rooms, from the different rooms that our cats spend time in, are actually parts of our design consideration for the garden where we live now. And so thinking about people, our gardens should be comfortable to be in. So maybe that means shade, functional, beautiful, maintainable, safe, durable, affordable, strive for a sustainable use of resources, local, nothing too exotic in the wood, edible, if you want. Sure, I always include vegetable plantings and fruit trees in my landscapes. We're not going to get too specifically into fruit trees or vegetable gardens in this class. There's so much to cover. But again, we have other workshops, some recorded online. Our fruit tree workshops are recorded online. If you are in California, that's going to be relevant to you. Farther out, maybe not that relevant. And coming up this spring, I'm going to be teaching an online workshop like this that's going to be just focused on raised bed garden for vegetables, vegetable garden construction, do it yourself, and also the basics of successfully growing vegetables. Again, specifically focused on Southern California, but outside of the seasonality, a lot of good content for people elsewhere. And so that's the people part. Also thinking about the planet. And so we're going to want, as we're thinking about how our gardens are designed, to hold and infiltrate water. If you want to learn more about that, we'll talk a little bit about it, but we have a whole rainwater harvesting for home gardens workshop up on our YouTube site right now. Our gardens should have relatively low demand for irrigation water, even for most of us in inland Southern California who are gardening with native plants local to our area. We're still going to probably want to do some irrigation, usually about once a month in the warm season, just to keep things looking a little bit fresher. Especially if you're in an area where fires are concerned, you're going to want to have stuff that you can irrigate. Coastal, sometimes people can get away without irrigation at all. Certainly in many other climates, people can get away with that, but low demand for irrigation water, definitely. Provide year-round habitat for birds, beneficial insects, lizards, and other critters you want to invite into your yard with plants and other features. Again, we have a whole workshop on that, gardening for birds, butterflies, pollinators, and more. You can either check out that recording on our YouTube site, or we'll also be teaching that coming up in the spring. And in all of that, our gardens also become educational spaces that connect us all to the wider world without us even having to leave our house. And so you really do get a sense over time of, especially if you're gardening with plants native to your areas, different birds that will come and go at different times of the year, different butterflies or pollinators that you will see on different cycles. And so that's really a whole other dynamic, not just giving back to the wild world, which is very important, but a whole other kind of dimension of pleasure that we can get from our own home landscapes. Adds a lot of depth. And so planting design is just one part of the design process. And the most important key thing, and we'll talk about it a couple of times, and if you've seen my other workshops, you've heard about it, but I'm going to keep repeating it because it's the most important part of design, horticulture, landscape maintenance, all of it. When it comes to plants and growing them at home, the most important thing is to put the right plant in the right place, which sounds logical, but a lot of people don't focus on that. And then that makes things more challenging over time, both for the aesthetics of the garden and for keeping the plants healthy, looking good, and keeping them low maintenance. You want to choose the right plant to go in the right place. So in putting plants together in our plant-focused spaces, it's critical to learn and respect the needs of that plant. So that means doing just a little bit of research for each plant that you are going to put in. Learn and respect those needs. And in most cases, there's going to be, wherever you are, databases of plants that are local to that area or nursery websites. Literally, if you're thinking about putting a plant in, look them up one at a time, learn some about it. That will take an afternoon to do and will benefit you for years and protect your financial investment in purchasing the plants for your garden. If you learn things that you think are going to be relevant to you later on, write it down, copy it into a file on your computer. Learn and respect the needs of the plants. Group plants with similar needs. That's sun, irrigation or soil moisture, the soils that it likes. Critical. Look up the mature size of each plant. Assume the plant is going to get that size, and it will often get that size somewhat quickly. So either leave that amount of open space directly around the plant, or if that's too large and you think it's going to take some time to grow in, put some other plants in there, but don't spend an arm and a leg, that are going to be sacrificial. And remember which ones are sacrificial and be ready to take those out when the main plant that you planted needs that space. Very critical, and something that where home gardeners go wrong very often. Plants get crowded after a few years. Respect the space those plants need. Don't worry so much that you're not going to do any layering, meaning if you plant a tree, once that tree is up enough, you might want to have plants underneath that tree, not just individual plants in a sea of mulch, but kind of that push and pull between the mature size of the plant, where you're going to put plants. Are plants going to be high canopy trees, low ground covers? And that's not too difficult to do if it sounds intimidating. If you think about it and look up the information for each plant and just make an attempt, you will be much better off than so many gardens that go in. And there's a pretty good chance that you will be quite successful. And then as you go, observe and learn both from what works and from what doesn't work. And after you do this for a number of years, you will start to realize that your most important lessons in garden design, sometimes your best insights, are going to be from learning from when things don't go well. I tell people that a lot of what I know about plants is because I've killed more plants over the years than the vast majority of other gardeners who I know. As long as you learn from those lessons, then you're going to be more successful continuously as time goes on. It's not always about being perfect the first time out. If you think through all of this stuff, your overall garden most likely will be very successful, and then learn from the little mistakes and tweak things as you go. For those of us in warm, hot areas, realize that most of our drought-tolerant plants, our California native plants, don't want a lot of the traditional horticultural care. They don't want much water. They don't want fertilizer. In the vast majority of situations, they don't want any compost as well. They're adapted to our regional soils. They evolved growing in those sorts of conditions. So don't do too much. Learn about their needs. That's going to be enough. The art is assembling the right plants and the right patterns in harmony with the right surrounding features. And so These are those major factors. Sun or shade. If a plant wants full sun, that's really defined as 6 or more hours of direct sunlight throughout most of the year. So it doesn't need to be blasting sun all day, all day. If it's on the east side of a house or the west side of a house, and so it's shade in the morning or shade in the afternoon, but really get sun throughout most of the day, that's going to be fine for being full sun. North side of the house, it's going to be in shadow a lot of the year. So you'll need plants that can take part shade, but then can deal with some sun in the middle of summer. Soil drainage. Most water-wise plants, Mediterranean, California native plants, not all, but most want what's called well-drained soil. There are plenty of them that are adapted to slower draining, or often they'll be on a list of plants for clay soil. But you want to have a sense of what your soil drainage is. In a workshop that we just recorded and put online, we go slide by slide through an example of a soil infiltration test. It's called Choosing, Purchasing, and Planting Water-Wise and California Native Plants. So if you're about to do that, I would encourage you to take a look at it. But essentially, you want to dig a few places in your garden that you're going to be replanting, about a 1 foot wide and 1 foot deep hole. Fill that hole with water a couple of times and let it drain out just to make sure that all the soil around that hole is saturated. And then fill it a third time, start a stopwatch, and see how many new inches of water have drained down every hour on the hour, and then average that out. If your soil is on average draining out 2 inches or more per hour, congratulations, you have well-drained soil. And between 1 and 2, that's kind of medium. Yeah, you can often get away with planting a lot of the plants that want well-drained soil, but if there's like a huge rain year, some of the plants might suffer. I've had some projects where that's kind of the drainage and everything does fine. Some where it's kind of hit or miss. Less than 1 inch per hour, you have slowly draining soil. In most cases, that just is what it is. You can't be successful like adding a bunch of sand to it. It'll just kind of more make concrete or cement. And yeah, what you want to do is just plant plants adapted to clay soil. There's plenty of them wherever you are. Sometimes it'll just make choosing the plants a little bit easier because there's less to choose from. Irrigation frequency. Are your plants going to want irrigation weekly, every other week, once a month, or not at all? Group those plants together so you can do your irrigation efficiently and keep the plants happy. What's the growth habit or the general shape? Is it something that goes up and then spreads? Is it low and horizontal? Is it a bush? Is it kind of shaped like a fountain? Look up if you're thinking about planting a plant and you see it small. Look up online a number of different pictures of what it looks like when it's mature. Just Google image search is great for that. You can type in the name of the plant and then click on images, and you'll be able to see it in a variety of situations, how people have used it in different designs usually. And the growth rate is sometimes available, sometimes hard to find. If you can find that information, that's great. If you can't, don't worry about it. The most important thing is make sure that if you're planting a slow growing plant and it's near fast growing plants, that you really give that slow growing plant some space around it where it's not going to be overwhelmed. So here's actually an example of a California native manzanita. Beautiful plant, worth growing in the garden. This is sunset manzanita with that beautiful new growth. Not super quick to get up and going in the garden. Next to, in the background, are native deer grass. Another great plant, but it grows extremely quickly. So making sure, really, this is from my front yard, that I gave that manzanita plenty of space so it's not going to get overwhelmed and then shaded out by the deer grass. For most of you, gardens don't need to have a huge number of different plants. The majority of people who I interact with don't want to become people who self-identify as, I am a gardener. My hobby is gardening. What I want to do on the weekend is spend time in my garden. If you are not one of those people who wants to do that, that's just fine. But don't plant too many different types of plants in your yard. I plant tons of different types of plants in my yard. My partner and I are both professional horticulture people, and our yard is also kind of like our research project. It's how we learn more about our craft. But for most people, what you want to do is fill each space that needs plants with one or a few different types of plants and concentrate on how to assemble them. The average suburban front yard that I'll design for someone, 12 to 15 different types of plants, probably, generally no more than 20. And if you want to really choose 5 great plants and work with patterns of those, you can still have something lovely. So keep it manageable, something where you can learn about what each plant needs and make sure you give it that care. One of the places where I see people most often go wrong is in an average suburban front yard. There'll be like 70, 80 different types of plants, one of this, one of that, 2 of this, 3 of that. And for someone who doesn't really want to spend tons of time in their garden, that becomes kind of overwhelming. And aesthetically, it's harder to be successful with that in terms of the look. It really takes a lot of skill to balance that kind of one of this and one of that kind of garden. Where if plants are carefully layered, grouped, as in something that's going to look great with 5 of them, and then 5 of another plant, then maybe 5 of a different plant, and then back to the first one, so that it's kind of a strong aesthetic statement, especially when it's in flower, or even just the leaf color or form. Groups are a key towards being successful for a casual gardener. Or do you want things randomly because that's what you want? Repetition is something that really, really helps with the aesthetic. And that's part of why I encourage you not to choose too many different plants. So you have room to do some repetition. And then maybe a few plants where they'll just be like one as an accent. Or are you going to work with plants where, like the ground cover in the lower right, the blue finger, there's a large swath along the edge? Those are the sorts of things to think about. We're not going to spend too much time going into that real planting design focused content. We have a couple of workshops for that online for those of you who are in Southern California, especially. We have favorite plants for inland gardens workshop, which for those of you in more coastal areas, all those plants are going to work on the coast as well. There's just some plants that are easier for you to grow out there that I don't recommend inland. So these are our favorite plants for inland, but those should work for you. And then the California native garden design workshops. For those of you who are in other areas, the kind of local approaches to planting design will quite likely be a little bit different because the plant types and ecosystem types out there are a little bit different. But here are the key things that really will unite all of us wherever we are. Thinking about color. But I said earlier, don't worry too much about flower color. And I stick by that. Leaf color, in terms of the aesthetics, is more important than flower color. The color and texture, which is the size and shape that makes up that texture of the leaves and the form of the plant, are what's going to be working 365 days of every year. And so you can see here, even though plants are green, in Southern California, we have all sorts of also gray greens, dark greens, almost silvers. And so there's the ground cover pigeon point coyote brush here. That's more of a true green, with the ground cover California sagebrush, with the Cleveland sage hybrid, probably like Allen Chickering sage. And these color combinations and the texture combinations between the very thin leaves and thicker leaves are things that are going to be working all of the time. And then when the flowers come, it's just a bonus. Grouping. So creating a greater aesthetic impact, like we talked about, by having groups of plants, especially for smaller perennials in the average home garden, where if you're dealing with plants that are only like a foot wide, 18 inches wide, oftentimes doing them in groups of 3 or 5, and then 3 or 5 of another one, then another one, then back to the first one, especially like along a driveway or a walk, can be very effective. Repetition. So if you're doing grouping, making sure you're able to repeat, or even here, like you can see the same sage repeated here and over there. And this was kind of a long walk along a sidewalk on the slope, and I think it repeated even more every so often, kind of creating a sense of pace in the landscape. And then accent or surprise might just be like one prominent, very beautiful shrub. Maybe it comes into flower dramatically, but only for a small part of the year. With the surprise, maybe you kind of turn a path and your eye is just directed towards, one very sculptural kind of plant, sometimes done with a succulent in Southern California. Those are the things you can be thinking about. And so here's one of my favorite texture combinations for my front yard. This is fragrant purple sage and native yarrow. And so you can see just a lovely visual contrast. Or here, this is a front yard in Pasadena, California, where the contrast between the cacti, but I think this also integrating California native shrubs and Mediterranean Pride of Madeira in the back adds so much to a yard other than just being a cactus and succulent focused yard. I think that the contrast in the texture and the form between the succulents, very strong form, and the shrubs really enhances the effect of both of them. So you can see here, this is, up close, I think that's extremely, extremely beautiful. But when we zoom out, it's, rather small front yard and something pretty achievable. The succulents were probably planted quite a bit smaller and just allowed to grow in over time. And mixed into this landscape, I was just driving down the street and pulled over to take some pictures because I thought it was lovely, are a variety of California native plants along the sidewalk. So beautiful flowering moments from our native white sage. It's the Allen Chickering, potentially Posa blue or whirly blue sage. These are all very closely related hybrids. They're almost identical in the landscape. The pinkish buds of California buckwheat. And so this is the experience of that, walking down the sidewalk. And, it's realistic home garden. There's a few weeds and things like that. But think about this compared to just the average lawn landscape and how much form and color and texture and the smells of the sage plant. It really creates an interesting experience, whether you're driving by, walking down the street, or coming home to it. And the combinations can be relatively simple. Sometimes simpler is better. So here is a planting that I designed at the Huntington Library, where it's a combination of grasses. And this is just one grass. It's called pine moly. It's a little dwarf Texas native cousin of our California native deergrass, forming all of this grass, just one species. And then just one selection of aloe, David Verity, repeated. So it's loose, kind of random looking, but because it's a very limited plant palette, it's able to kind of hold together with then taller trees and shrubs in the background. And then here, just kind of echoing the form, a little bit of South African red hot poker, where you don't even notice the leaves, which is intentional because the leaves aren't that attractive and don't look great during part of the year. So they just kind of fade back in with the grasses. But then when they send their flowers up, they kind of echo the aloes as well. And so none of this requires any particular insight into design, but researching plants, just looking at things, seeing what might look good grouped together, and just kind of taking your time and keeping it relatively simple. As I've struggled with different designs over time, made mistakes and tried to learn from them, one of the things I'm constantly reminding myself is to keep things simple. And as I'm working on a landscape design that feels a little bit off balance or not right, oftentimes it's removing one or two or three different species of plants and simplifying it a little bit is the final push that gets me to a place where I'm content with it. Here is a pre-existing tree and a landscape that I worked on the design for. And for here, along the front, it was just one right choice, California native deergrass meadow, because you have the form of this old tree and it just needed something simple. I think there is one sage in there that flowers and accents every once in a while. And so a lot of the slides that you're going to see here have images credited to the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour. Theodore Payne Foundation is a local nonprofit based in the San Fernando Valley here in Southern California. It's part of Los Angeles. And they're really dedicated to conservation of native plants, and a large part of their work is through the promotion and demonstration of urban horticulture with plants native to the region. And so every spring they put on a great tour where you get insights into gardens all around the region. And it's really one of the best places to see a variety of well thought out home gardens available. So every year I go and I take many, many pictures. This year they're doing something different because of the pandemic. It's going to be all online as a series of online events and resources that's going to be taking place from spring through fall. So for anyone in California, even if you are a little bit farther out where you wouldn't normally be able to drive out to that, I'd encourage you to check that out. And I find just as much inspiration, it's about the plants, but I find just as much inspiration just seeing how people set up their landscapes. And so one example, different style than I personally like. I like a more naturalistic landscaper. But if you like a more formal aesthetic, you can still work with, this is probably 85% California native landscape, but created with a more traditional aesthetic, substituting what would be a lawn with a native yarrow, which gets mown every so often, and then can flower in the spring. You see just one coming out. It's going to be covered in beautiful white flowers. And then keeping a bit of a more clipped edge, but working with primarily native plants. And so just wanted to show that as a transition point because we've looked at a lot of mostly kind of more naturalistic looking gardens. And so now we're going to answer some questions and then shift to going through those key elements of residential gardens. So let's see what came in. From Garrett, welcome Garrett, I owe you an email. How sturdy are ground cover plants in case I need to cross over them? That's part of doing your research. It depends on the ground cover plant. A lot of them can't take foot traffic, but some of them can, like that yarrow lawn that I just showed. That could take casual foot traffic, no problem at all. Wouldn't want to do like soccer practice every day on it, but yeah, you could definitely walk over it. And in my front yard, I have a whole area accessing my bird bath. That's yarrow, and I walk over it, drag hoses over it. So it just depends. From Maria, please repeat how to do the water drainage test. I'll hold that till the end after we have a lot of stuff to cover, but I definitely would be happy to do that towards the end. I'm seeing a few kind of more about my garden questions, which is fine. I'm just gonna have to hold those over till the end. Okay, that was all the, so I think that's all in the Q&A. Okay, some pest control questions. Again, I will hold those till the end. And then I guess this one is relevant overall. Someone, Paola, asked, how many different kinds of plants would you recommend for a 180 square foot garden? Good question. Small gardens are sometimes trickier to design than large gardens because you have such a little bit of space. I think you can go a couple of different directions for a really small garden, like 180 square feet. If your aesthetic goes in that direction, that might be a place where you have a little bit more of a one of this and one of that, because there's just not that much trouble you can get into with such a small garden. If you like a more eclectic look, what I would do is you might have some plants where you do one each, but I would definitely choose one or two plants that then you kind of repeat along that whole garden, or you might go super simple and have just like 5 different plants. Definitely choose, say, 2 or 3 plants that you're going to use in repetition. You'll probably be working with a number of smaller perennials, and then maybe you also might want it anchored by one small tree or a shrub or something like that. So I'm going to take a sip of water. And let's jump into our key elements of residential gardens. So this is just, before we go on, this is an example of a front yard landscape that I think does the not too complicated part quite well. You can see, like often happens, There's going to need to be some decisions made here. Plants are starting to crowd. Probably this front plant, this Dianella, will need to come out to make more room for the coast rosemary, but that's fine. But you can see large swaths of this Mediterranean Dianella in the front, coast rosemary, a few agaves, one accent, really beautiful California native manzanita, and then bunches of the California native deergrass, and then a few, again, more Dianella, it looks like, probably back here. And there's a few individual accents, a few potted plants, but keeping it pretty simple and elegant with large swaths. But then look at this contrast. So there's not a lot of flowering going on, but as these agaves get bigger, especially, and the deergrass, beautiful contrast of form and of leaf color, which is really holding this garden design together. So as we get into our different elements of residential landscapes, remember that these elements are being presented as separate, but they're not going to be that way in the real world. They're all going to overlap and interact, and that's going to be part of the fun of design. Thinking about the functional needs and the look you want for each element goes a long way into making it come out beautifully. It's not helpful to have a beautiful patio if it's too hot and too sunny, because the plants around it don't provide shade at the right time of the day, just for example. So let's talk some first about people spaces. And so you can see here, really people-focused place in a front yard garden that I took some pictures of, with a bench right along the sidewalk, a little free library, a hammock, and then some planting spaces around it. Really set up to enjoy the day. So thinking about people spaces, the most important thing is to focus on what's going to be comfortable, a comfortable space you want to spend time in. Think about your yard as a series of outdoor rooms. Patios, do you need a picnic table or a dining table? Are you going to need chairs in an area? Making sure that your space for that is going to comfortably accommodate the chairs, pulling those chairs out, pushing them back in if that's an issue. Do you want a hammock? Permanent space for it, temporary space for it. Remember that in a hot, dry climate, physical comfort inside the house and outside of the house can be really impacted with shade. So you're going to want either deciduous plants or trees that lose their leaves, or evergreen shade on the west side of both buildings. If you have space to put an evergreen tree or a deciduous tree on the west side of a house, that will shade the house in the afternoon. That will make those rooms cooler over time. And definitely outdoor patios and gathering spaces. If you want to use those in the early evening when it's still sunny in the summer, you want shade on the west side if at all possible. Prioritize casting shade on the west or with deciduous shade, south-facing windows of a building. Out in your garden is great. You could also frame views from inside of the house through the windows. Cool the ground, especially near areas you will spend time in. And what does that mean? Essentially, that means covering the majority of the ground with plants. So for example, in Southern California, having a patio space that's surrounded with gravel and a few succulents is not going to feel both physically and psychologically as nice as maybe that same space covered with, could be very low water native, but green plants, ground covers, and perennials that will spread and kind of cover that space. Avoid more concrete, asphalt, and even permeable paving than necessary. So here's a few examples. I really like this front yard landscape. This creates a room with a view. The rest of the landscapes in this neighborhood were at a pretty steep slope, and so they decided to terrace it, created some great space for a very attractive mix of native and Mediterranean plantings, and then a great patio space. And you'll often see that in front yard landscapes that are redone with beautiful plants and create new perspectives. Patio spaces start to show up in front yards. People actually want to spend time in their front yards. This is decomposed granite, which is a permeable substance. It's kind of like a very, very fine gravel, often used in pathways and more naturalistic like parks and public spaces as well. If you have a current concrete patio, the price is right. It is quite a bit of work, but that concrete can be broken up and then reused instead of going to the landfill right in place with oftentimes either a small gravel, which can be a trip hazard if it gets up and onto the concrete, or decomposed granite as the infill. Can be weeding to deal with, but it is very permeable and a really nice space to be in. Here is another picture from that same landscape that we looked at the beginning of this section. Again, another little decomposed granite patio with some chairs. I really like this picture as well because you can see this person, maybe from the Northeast living in Southern California, they had definitely had a connection with hydrangea and Japanese maple. But instead of having a whole high water garden, just in a kind of shadier corner, tucked one of each, they can just water this extra with a hose. Everything else in the garden is very well adapted to where the garden is. And then remember to make your functional spaces function. For lawns, do you need one? Maybe you do. If you have a dog that needs to spend some time on a lawn, you might need one. If you have a kid who's just learning to walk, you might want one. Good place to fall on. There are many good reasons to have a lawn. But if you have a lawn, how large of one do you need? You probably don't need wall to wall in the front yard and the backyard. How large should it be for your needs? If you just need a bit of space for a small dog, maybe not that much. Outdoor eating. Think about barbecue, dining. Where are those areas going to be relative to each other to make everything convenient? Make all of your locations really practical. And as you're starting to think through where you might want things, spend some time either, in the morning with a cup of coffee, or probably in addition to that in the afternoon with maybe a drink or something like that. Kind of walk through your day, your weekends, how you would want to spend space in your yard, and then walk through that design. Picture it in your head. Think of all of the different things that you might do, weekdays, weekends, social events. Would that flow through your landscape of where you're thinking about putting different elements for your social spaces make sense? Will it work for you? Really easy, especially before you even have it down on paper or after, but before you build anything or buy anything, to think out multiple different ways that things might go together and walk through it. Sometimes I'll actually get out and even kind of mark things out, like with that old bag of flour, or like in my yard, we had a really big kind of somewhat broken up concrete back patio. I got out there with sidewalk chalk and started chalking out how I might want to change things, what areas I might want to break off of that to make it smaller. So whatever you need to do, kind of stakes, string, kind of sketch it out in your landscape and try a few different things. Don't just go with the first one that you think of. Design with your body, especially when you start thinking about pathways and connections to spaces. That's really critical. Make sure things are going to be comfortable. And even like for outdoor dining, especially if you're thinking about doing a patio space where you're going to have an outdoor dining area, think about the size of the outdoor dining table that you either already have or might want to have. And you can, look up from different catalogs or manufacturers online. Literally, you might go outside and mark that out, and then think about chairs, and then think about pulling out a chair and maybe someone needing to walk behind it. And sometimes what you will realize is that maybe a patio space wants to be, 3 feet or so wider than you were planning on it. But in reality, that 3 feet might make all the difference between people needing to move too close to each other, or chairs tipping off the edge of a patio if it's a little too small. These small little tweaks that we can account for by kind of sketching things out in our landscape and testing it, walking through it, making sure it'll work, can make such a big difference in our end satisfaction and utility of our spaces. And so here's a great example. This person did want a small lawn. They're using a lower water native-ish lawn called buffalo grass, which has a little bit more of a meadowy effect in most cases, but will do what a lawn does. Wouldn't stand up to like daily soccer practice, but just about anything else, just fine. And then walk along that with decomposed granite, with steel landscape edging, which I think in a lot of cases is going to be the cleanest looking one, lasts a long time, looks better and stays in place better than plastic landscape edging. And regionally out here in the Inland Empire, there's just a lot of contractors really like to use those wide concrete curbs, which never look quite right often in a residential space. Those are more suited for like commercial spaces with lawnmowers riding over them. That would damage things like this. So I think this is just really lovely for someone who needs a small lawn, then everything else surrounded by low water plants. Here's another example of a buffalo grass lawn. Kind of looks like a fine Bermuda grass that's more tufted, but can be very lovely different times of the year. Goes brown in the depth of the winter down here, but doesn't look unattractive as long as you know that that's coming and that's natural. I really like how this homeowner reclaimed an unused driveway space. Lots of people in Southern California will have these very long driveways to detached garages, but they'll just park in the front of the house anyways, because a lot of people use their garages for storage. So a simple arbor with a grapevine and some patio space really extends what was an otherwise small backyard. Don't necessarily need to have a super fancy, super expensive outdoor kitchen. A grill and some sort of side table often works really well. And if you are focused on what you're doing with the food, you can cook food that's just as delicious as something that costs thousands and thousands of dollars for, a setup that essentially is just the same. The most important thing is to think about, where do you want this relative to your kitchen, your refrigerator, someplace where it's going to be easy to walk outside and then do what you want to do, and then maybe bring that food either back in or to the patio space where you'll eat. And then if you do need a paved surface for whatever you're going to be doing, or maybe want it to be paved closer to the house, but then you're going to be having social events and other things like that where you need more space, consider a combination paving effect. This is actually at the California Botanic Garden in Claremont, but I think illustrates it very well. Like, for example, you generally don't want decomposed granite like right at your house, because if you're walking over decomposed granite and then immediately inside, you will track a little bit of that in your shoes, and that could be really hard on wood floors and just messy. But it's a great material. And as long as you're walking across some concrete or some lawn or something else, most of that will fall off of your shoes. And so maybe a smaller concrete patio, or paved stones or sandset brick if you want it to be permeable, but something smaller that's not. And then if you have a spill out space you need for social events, it can be the much less expensive, more attractive, and also water permeable decomposed granite. I like this narrow side yard, working with very closely clipped ceanothus, and then just what looks like normal hardware store pavers, but kind of becomes very modern looking and dramatic with a very long straight line of them. This is an example. This is my backyard, where we had inherited, when we bought the house, this huge concrete patio that was quite broken, and we removed about a third of it and then reused that broken concrete to create a broken concrete patio space elsewhere in our yard. So we would have, after trees grow in, a shadier space, a sunnier space. We have a young tree now, this was under construction, planted here, which will provide that western shade. And then even using some of that broken concrete for this little retaining space where we dug down a place to infiltrate water and created a terrace, and then just use rocks that we dug up in our rocky soil, and then that concrete here to create a bench, and just be creative with it. Gravel patio spaces are often quite inexpensive to put in. Not as much labor as like doing actual paved stones or anything like that. Very permeable and can be quite lovely as long as there's a little bit of shade or shelter with them. Another example, backyard fire pit, whatever you want. Individual paving stones with plants growing underneath, just all sorts of different approaches. I really personally like approaches that kind of have a nice balance between a formal aesthetic or formal lines and in the hardscape, and then really that kind of lets things get wild a little bit more or informal with the planting. Often looks really nice. Or just keeping things very informal. Flagstone can also be dry set in between, where that will allow water to continue to permeate as well instead of being set in mortar if they're installed well. Really like the shade from the shrubs / small trees nearby. So very nice space at this garden in the western San Fernando Valley. So really hot in the summer, but the sense of lushness from very low water use, native plants, and then just simple, very naturalistic understory planting. I really like the transition, how the rocks kind of transition in between the spaces. And so next we're going to look at connection spaces. I think we'll answer some questions and then kind of move on to the more environmentally focused spaces. Did see a question came in from JP. For any of you who weren't here at the very beginning, this is recorded and will be available after some light editing of downtime by the end of the day on Monday on our YouTube channel. And I'm typing the link right now into the chat. You go to cbwcd.org/YouTube, that will get you to the recordings of all of our past workshops that we've been doing online for getting close to a year now. So connection spaces. By connection spaces, I mean paths and access. So that might be between your house and your patio space, might be what you need to roll your trash cans down in between your plants to get to your street side for trash pickup, or just in between or going through different parts of your garden. Really important concepts. Plants grow. Give yourself enough room. Something that I see all of the time is people planting plants that are going to be too wide, too close to the edge of a path. And again, like at 6 months, things look great, but oftentimes by year 2, those plants need to get hacked back all of the time to keep the path passable. And then the form of those plants is just kind of lost and ruined. It never looks great. And sometimes plants getting larger than you expect them to do, or even larger than your research tells you they will be, is just what's going to happen. And so as you plan out how wide to make the paths in your landscape, I've really become a fan of, if you're going to be planting right up against the edge of it, which I normally do, maybe oversizing your paths just a little bit more space than you think you need. So for example, most people can walk around in a garden pretty comfortably on a 2-foot path. But if you only put a 2-foot wide path in your garden, and then one of your plants on one side grows a foot larger than you expect it to be, and another plant on the other side grows a foot larger than you expect it to be, you have no path at all. You have to start hacking plants back. So I'll more often, even in a residential backyard, if there's space, design a minimum 3, but often, because I'm working with California native plants that can get kind of rambunctious in a good way, I'll often put in a 4-foot path. And so that way, if plants start growing farther over the edge of the path than I'm expecting, then everything just looks nice and natural. And there's always going to be some growing over the edge of the path. So usually in terms of functional walking space, not much more than 3 feet, which feels good as well. Give yourself a little bit more room than you think for pathways. If you're planting along them, you'll probably be better off. Use permeable surfaces like broken concrete, gravel, decomposed granite, or sand set pavers, or just wood chip mulch, which is often what I do at my home gardens. Is when things go in, everything gets a layer of wood chip mulch. And then as the plants grow in, they'll mulch themselves. But for the pathways, those will be the only things that I continue to remulch. Consider where the eye goes as someone's going to walk on the path and different focal points. Do you intentionally want a long straight path that goes to a particularly beautiful shrub or plant at the end of that path, or little sculpture in your garden or bird bath? Or do you want a weaving, meandering path where it kind of forces the eye to look in different directions as that path curves? Sometimes you don't have a lot of choices in a small yard. It just needs to be pretty functional, and you make it look lovely along it. in between the only two places where it makes sense for the path to go. But sometimes you do have many options, and whether you decide to have things be more straight or more curvilinear will really impact the feel of the space. So here's an example of the front yard garden in Pasadena that I really admire. This was designed by the homeowner, first garden that he put in, relatively small front yard, all California native plants. It's on the Theodore Payne Foundation tour. And then this kind of ring, about 3/4 inch pea gravel path along the edge. It's kind of very natural looking. One raised bed with some stone. And both the path is great for access to do work, but also provides part of that sense of structure, because it would feel, if it was wall to wall, kind of these shrubs, it would feel very kind of dense and not necessarily that inviting. But just having this low point and this path to circulate through really helps balance the feel of the path. And in the small space, it's not a huge path and things do kind of grow close together. But I think in this space, it feels kind of intimate, and you can see that the owner is kind of on doing his pruning, so things haven't gotten overgrown, and looks rather nice. It's another stabilized decomposed granite path with steel edging. So this is an example for residential path. This is probably 4.5 feet wide, of allowing that path to be big. So then when these native buckwheats want to be kind of rambunctious and spreading, they can be, and you still have plenty of room to walk. Here's broken concrete stepping stones, just mulch in between. This garden has not been fully planted out yet. Coming along. I'm also a fan of just using river rock cobble along the edge of a path, and then decomposed granite for the path surface. Feels very nice and natural. And especially along like concrete or asphalt driveways, as long as you're working with plants that can take that heat and take that sun. Here it's mostly annual wildflowers, so a lot of these will be gone by midsummer, but I'm really, just as an example, a fan of allowing and planning for just the edges. If there's not going to be tires rolling right up at the edges, just the edges to be obscured a little bit helps the whole area feel so much more relaxed, so much more natural, really helps the garden design. And there's a number of small shrubs as well that can take the reflected heat. Here's apricot mallow, which does great with that heat, some California fuchsia. And then sometimes you just don't have a lot you can do in a narrow space, but thinking about working with containers can really provide just that pop of connection along that space in between the front yard and the backyard. I really like this landscape. It was designed by a very talented landscape architect named Josh Link, Ecotone Studios. And here he really rethought this whole long driveway, and with concrete bands and gravel created this, feels more like an entrance courtyard that then just dissolves out of the driving space with the same gravel mulch into this really beautiful blue toned, focused on like foliage color and contrast and form landscape. Very lovely. Or kind of much more formal, a combination of slightly mounded areas, working with native plants and mulched, and then just stepping stones with a little bit of gravel in between to create a little bit more of a sense of space. Very achievable do-it-yourself project. I really like to mix as well. This is just from a part of a path in my garden where it'll be a mulch pathway, but then working with gravel and cobblestones on the side, just as definition in areas of accent. And then if we have some branches or tree trimmings, we'll mix those in as well. This is also kind of quite nice for habitat and happens informally in our yard. Just as we're digging and planting, we accumulate rock and stone, and then we just kind of pile them here and there. And I've been just kind of building that over a few years. So with that, let's take a look and see if there's any questions before we move on to talking some about plant spaces. some very specific ones. So someone asked about the link for the Theodore Payne tour, nativeplantgardentour.org. We'll get you there. Some very pruning questions. We can get to those towards the end. Very specific, what kind of grasses do you recommend? Kind of hold those to the end. Question about the mulch that we were just talking about. Is the wood chip mulch a fire hazard? In most cases, no, but it depends on where you live. Like, for example, for a typical suburban or urban backyard, kind of within the urban matrix, it's not a huge fire hazard. Should there be a spark or something like that, most of the time won't catch it all, or would just kind of smolder a little bit. Where having wood chip mulch kind of right near the house is not a good idea is if you're in the urban wildland interface, more rural area, or for us, like in Southern California, if you're living like in the hills right up against the mountains or a state park area where there is fire, then when an intense fire comes through the whole area, that could provide fuel for a fire of that intensity. And you might want to really focus on an inorganic mulch, decomposed granite or gravel in those situations. But in the typical suburban urban front yard, it's considered to be fine and safe. Okay. And some very specific question. What about gravel versus concrete walkways? I would generally prefer to go with gravel as long as it's going to be kind of safe. You can also use like a more angular, a lot of the pea gravels are like crushed, and that angular gravel holds together. Versus concrete. If you're thinking about wheelchair accessibility, someone who relies on a cane or something like that, then concrete is really thrives in those situations. But it does then create a situation where it's sending water in a certain direction. And so the nice thing about gravel is it feels very naturalistic, or decomposed granite. It crunches kind of nicely under the foot, and then it will absorb a lot of that water in place. So you don't need to worry about that water rushing somewhere and what's going to happen to it. So, everything is kind of site specific, what's going to work. Would rocks attract snakes, etc.? Just as a low mulch layer, probably not specifically. If you have like boulders and things like that here and there, potentially if you're in that urban wildland interface area. But if you're in a normal suburb where you don't have snakes, it's not like they're going to show up all of a sudden. So I would say that that's just going to depend on your comfort level. I can't tell you that, don't worry about it at all, because I don't know where you are. Everything is specific. I know where I am in suburban Pomona on the eastern edge of Los Angeles County, and kind of in all of the other suburban gardens that I've ever grown in, and even the kind of urban landlocked botanical gardens, I've never had to worry about that. Does decomposed granite come in different sizes and colors? Normally, it's going to be the same size, which when it packs together, there's just a little bit of loose material, but it's a very small particle, so it mostly holds together. And then the color it comes in, it does come in different colors. Oftentimes in a region, there's going to be one like primary local color. So for us, that is that kind of tan color. But like in Northern California, a little bit more often, you'll see like a gray color. I think that's produced locally up there. And for that, like you can get it down here, but it's less likely. I think the tan color looks quite nice in most yards. From Judy, what do you think of a swale in the overall look? We'll be talking about swales when we talk about water spaces in just a few moments. Cynthia, I mentioned the term stabilized decomposed granite. What do I mean by stabilized? Is it just compacted or treated with something else? So stabilized, when you buy decomposed granite from most sources, you can buy it either stabilized or with stabilizer in it or without. And so the stabilizer is actually a different, or it's an additional product that's put into the mix, which as that mix is going down, it's wetted to just kind of general moist, not sopping wet level, and compacted. And when it's wetted, that mix kind of activates and it locks it together more than if it was just the loose decomposed granite, which stays quite a bit looser. So normally if it's a pathway or a patio, you would want to use the stabilized decomposed granite. And if it's to use as like a mulch layer of a few inches of the decomposed granite in a planting area, you would go with just the natural, not stabilized decomposed granite. There are different products used for the stabilizer, but the most common one that I'm aware of, at least regionally down here, is one that is a natural product based on a psyllium husk, I believe. And so you could find out by asking your supplier if you're concerned of what is in it. Opinion regarding rubber mulch. I would never recommend anyone uses rubber mulch. It's made by recycled tires. It's a nice thought, it's recycled, but oftentimes there's problems with heavy metals in it, and it's extremely, like, that is flammable, especially if you live anywhere where you are in the urban wildland interface. Basically, if it catches, you have a tire fire in your garden. But yeah, it's recycled, but it's nasty stuff. And it's not great for the plants. Okay. What about a risk of termites with wood chip mulch up next to the house? Can't say it will never happen, but I have been gardening around wood chip mulch for a long time, and I've never seen termites really in that wood chip mulch. Not an issue with most people. If you are particularly concerned, you might do like a small band of rock or gravel mulch, and then if you want to use wood chip mulch farther out, not up against your house, but I don't worry about it. I've never had a problem with it. Okay, some more specific questions. So we will get to those at the end. I think it's time for us to get moving on. Oh, then someone asked for me to repeat the native plant tour link, so I will put that in the chat before we get going on. That's nativeplantgardentour.org. I just put that into the chat. Okay, talking about plant spaces. So plant spaces should be an integral part of your design, but there is a reason why I am covering them after we talk about the people spaces and the connecting spaces. Not because they're less important, but because when somebody, average homeowner, looks out at a empty front yard and backyard and thinks, what should I plant there? It's quite overwhelming. There's so many directions to go. And so by thinking through your kind of functional lifestyle needs, patios, grilling space, all that sort of stuff, thinking through the connections, driveway, where you still need to, maintain a path from your backyard through for the trash cans, that cuts across the front yard, for example, sometimes, all those little practical things. And then the social spaces. What often happens is that the wider landscape starts to get broken down into some more manageable chunks. Where the pathways are going to have to come through for the travel. And so then larger spaces slowly become smaller. If your patio is going to be there in a certain space, that might define, well, you want a tree on the west side of that patio for your afternoon shade. And then once you know that you're going to have a medium-sized tree there, maybe you realize that, okay, I'll have some perennial plants around the side of it, and then it will kind of build up behind that to some larger shrubs as a backdrop. And so, again, not that the plant spaces are less important, but that oftentimes those plant spaces will frame your other functions in the garden. And then it could be an iterative process, kind of back and forth. Well, I need a little bit more space to fit, that shrub I wanted. And so maybe the patio kind of pushes here or there. And so thinking through those plant spaces in the context starts to break things down a little bit more. For example, here, the pathway was going to come through here somewhere on the left in this garden. Just go to the other slide. There's this water space, this swale that goes through there, and then the pathway. And so then that starts to break down. Well, there's going to be room for a larger shrub here where there's a little bit more depth to the landscape, but here it'll be kind of mostly smaller material. Starts to kind of build that. It kind of just defines the sense of shape through here. And then it becomes a little bit easier to think about what might fit into those spaces. And again, it could be a push and pull kind of process where then you decide, well, I need a little bit more space here. So I want the angle of the path to actually change. And that kind of iteration kind of back and forth is part of the process of design. And when we do our example, towards the end, we'll talk about it, a process of working on tracing paper so you can quickly go through different iterations. But by the time you start to really define your space, and then you think about what you want, maybe how you would want to frame windows with shrubs to have, not block the whole thing, but maybe just have a few branches go over it. Thinking about the look that you might want from the curb looking forward, as well as out of the windows in the house. And then going back to what we talked about before, right plant, right place, sun, shade, size. And then looking at the lists of plants that might work well for your local area, it starts to kind of whittle it down and become very logical to choose what plants you might want. Here's just some other examples. And again, it doesn't need to be all or nothing. So this is actually a private school, so it's a decently large property. And so they left some of the lawn on a separate irrigation system, and then really created this great, beautiful envelope up around the building itself. Thinking about just very functional things. The shrub is creating more of a vegetative presence in front of this fence. And then underneath the shrub, a nice little band of perennial plants, and then a beautiful pathway. More formal layout to fit the style of this house. Or a really naturalistic look, really like at this Craftsman house, where there's a focus on shrubs, small trees, some perennials, but then also this interplay of the stone and the mulch. It's quite lovely. I really like this as an example of how to deal with what was a relatively narrow space and having an anchor of a large shrub kind of prune up like a small tree, a toyon, where the branches are just kind of in this very lovely way obscuring part of the window. So where from inside of the house, you can still see out, but you also get this really immediate sense of the garden all of the time, this evergreen large shrub, and then working with smaller shrubs, and then where it gets tighter, working with perennial plants. Again, those functional spaces, don't forget about leaving some nice space for your trash cans. And then oftentimes what you will see is a balanced landscape will have taller plants in the back, medium plants in the center, and then maybe smaller plants along the edge. Very different landscape, but similar example. Taller plants in the back. This is a young Desert Museum Palo Verde tree that will continue to grow in and kind of anchor this whole space. And then larger shrubs towards the back, and then just kind of a smaller band of some beautiful mix of native and Mediterranean perennial plants along the edges. That also keeps landscape maintenance much more manageable because the shrubs stay farther back and are less likely to grow over the edges of the path, where the perennials tend to be a little bit more predictable in how wide they will grow and the pruning they can take. And then in those transition spaces between plants and pavement, thinking that through a little bit, in many cases with a more naturalistic looking garden, the look of having something that will separate the wood chip mulch, for example, from concrete, asphalt, whatever, using cobble, whatever your local stone is, as kind of an interface, and then mixing some of that stone in farther back is a common, really lovely way of separating that transition. So we've talked some about mulch. Let's talk a little bit more specifically about mulch. Mulch really just means something that's covering and shading the soil. And in Southern California, is really, really helpful for our gardens, both to prevent the sun directly from hitting the soil and evaporating the water out of the soil, drying it out, and also to shade the soil and help keep it cool during the summer, which the plants really appreciate. Really just means anything covering and shading the soil. Could be decomposed granite, could be gravel, could be wood chips, could be rubber chunks, though I never recommend that. It should match both what the plants are going to want and the look that you're going to want. So in general, for the types of plantings that we would have in California, I'd recommend wood chips for woodland type plantings, definitely fruit trees, and things that like rich soil, like if you're growing roses or something like that. Gravel or decomposed granite, also sometimes called inorganic mulch, and then the wood chips are sometimes called organic mulch. So those gravels, decomposed granite, rock, for California native plants that really like hot, dry areas, desert plants, or for drier natives, also like kind of chaparral kind of stuff. I'll often end up with a combination of kind of wood chips and then mixing in some gravel and cobblestone and things like that. Especially when the garden is young, just kind of doing like wall-to-wall gravel can feel very oppressive. There's a lot of material to buy, and you can really, oftentimes, if there's enough plant density, after a couple of years, most of that gravel would just be covered up and never seen again by the plants and buried in the plant's natural leaf litter that's creating mulch over time. And so what I'll often do is I'll call it one and done wood chip mulching, where in a planted area, when it's planted, it might get like wall to wall, other than not right up against the plants, but pretty much wall to wall in the open areas, wood chip mulch of 2 to 3 inches deep. And then maybe I'll mix in just a little cobblestone or gravel just for the look of it. But then as the plants grow in, the plants are mostly covering the area. So you're not going to have a lot of wood chip over time. And then there might just be a mix of kind of that natural leaf litter and some rock and gravel in the open areas. If you want to get way more into it and see way more pictures of different types of mulch, really go into where to source mulch, advantages and disadvantages of different kinds. We have a whole workshop for that, which is online. It's our Compost and Mulch for Waterwise Gardens workshop, where we also get into compost as well. So this is an example to me of inorganic or gravel and decomposed granite mulch done well. Naturalistic, combination of different sizes. It doesn't just look like someone dumped a truck and raked it out. There's a little bit of artisticness to it. This is a project that was designed by someone putting in their first garden. He obviously has a knack for it. This kind of the gravel mulch kind of then just naturally goes down into this dry stream bed area that captures some water from the roof. And over here, they have the decomposed granite as some contrast with some other rock and boulders mixed in to kind of tie the whole thing together. I think this is absolutely lovely and an appropriate use of gravel. Very different entirely from those images I showed at the beginning of the class. And so here you can see an example of that early on in the landscape wood chip mulch with a little bit of rock here and there, that over time, as this grows in, you'll see very little of this, but it's something that will cover the landscape at a low cost and looks just fine and is perfectly okay for the plants because it's not right up against the base of the plants for the first couple of years. And then eventually You can largely grow your own just as the leaf litter of the plants drop in a naturalistic landscape or a mixed landscape like any of these, even if it has a little bit more of a formal layout. You don't need to like rake out and blow away all the leaves that are naturally falling over time, as long as the plants are healthy. Every once in a while, it's a good idea to make sure that the bases of the individual plants aren't buried, but then all that material just starts to kind of do its self-mulching thing like it would in nature. And so remember, you want to keep it maintainable. Ask yourself, how much time do you realistically want to be spending maintaining the garden? Are you going to do it? Or are you going to hire someone else to do it? And are you going to be setting yourself or that other person up for long-term success with the design? If you want it to be really low maintenance, like I mentioned, consider strong groupings or blocks of no more than 10 or 15 or so different low maintenance plants. Could be less. And then maybe you'll have a couple of just like individual specimen accents of one thing that kind of breaks the pattern. So this is just a front yard example of relatively simple landscape. And from this view, I have most of the plants labeled, not every single one, but anchored by a large Engelmann oak tree, a kept low, almost hedge of a California native manzanita along the walk, then another California native common ground cover that likes part shade in inland areas, Yankee Point ceanothus, kind of with this dark green, a little bit of this taller, lighter green manzanita shrub back in, and then low succulent along the walkway to the front, blue finger, echoing the darker green, a little bit of rosemary in the back, and then some accents from aloes and a single desert spoon, more dramatic succulent there. Very simple, very easy to maintain over time. Looks absolutely lovely and elegant. Here's another example of a much narrower or shorter front yard in Pomona. Hedge of happens to be the same, some of the same plants. That wasn't intentional. I just grabbed these two simple landscapes and put them in. But that same Howard McMinn manzanita kept as a taller hedge. Blue finger, which works great as a low maintenance accent right along an edge. Some aloes, toyon for the one large shrub, and then some of the native Allen Chickering sages. So, couple notes on putting plants together, and then we will do a brief example of using an online resource for looking up plant information that will show us how we might want to think about putting these together. So for putting plants together, remember, right plant, right place, learn and respect the plant needs, group the plants with similar needs, look up and respect that mature size, but don't isolate it too much. We're not talking about a couple of little plants in a sea of mulch. And if you're working on paper, remember, if you draw like what's going to be a 20-foot tree, it's going to take quite a while to become a 20-foot tree. So think a little bit about what's going to be layered underneath it. And that's like an example of, if the shade is going to change, then if there's some plants that you like that can take either that full sun at the beginning and then some part shade, maybe those would be good plants for that area. And then over time, observe and learn from what works and what doesn't work. So I'm just going to quickly show you one example of an online database for Southern California. Most of these will work for Northern California as well. And for people in semi-arid or dry areas, we do have a lot of plants that will also grow well out into the desert. This is the Inland Valley Garden Planner created by our agency to help people in specifically inland Southern California, although again, a lot of this information is great elsewhere. This has detailed plant profiles of a little over 350 plants, which you are likely to find as long as you're going to nurseries that carry water-wise plant material. And also we find that they grow very well for home gardens. So if this whole thing is rather overwhelming for you, both on this website as well as sometimes on other websites for other regions, you'll find something where there's like already pre-coordinated lists of plants that you can create a whole garden around a different theme. So for here, for example, if you want a butterfly and songbird garden or a sculptural succulent garden or a meadow garden or a Mediterranean garden, here's lists that are all ready to go, where these plants will work well together. And we have examples of around this different theme: tree, shrub, perennials, and coverage of horticultural preferences, irrigation, etc. But then the real heart of this is our plant finder. And again, a lot of other databases will have these searchable links where you can say, for our area, if you want a shrub that's going to be in full sun, low water needs, and you also want to use it as a hedge or a screen, well, then you've gone from 350 plants to 25, and maybe you do have slowly draining soil. So there, now you're down to 12. And you can take a look at individual ones. Some of them will be shrubs and screens or hedges or screens of different heights. Some will be lower. Oh, you also want it to attract butterflies. Well, now you have just a couple of choices. And then you can go from there and learn about them. And so lots of other regions have created things that are similar or might have individual plant lists local to your region. So one good place to start is looking at like suggestions from local botanic gardens is a good place to start. Some of those will have them, or also sometimes nurseries, and ask around and go from there. Google is a powerful tool for finding things like this local to your area. If there's a local native plant society as well, or native plant group, they often have put a lot of resources into developing either plant lists or databases as well. And then for those of you in any parts of California, calscape.org, which is a project of the California Native Plant Society, is a great resource as well. One thing to mention, so when you go to calscape.org, the initial interface, first thing it'll do is ask you your zip code, and it'll tell you all the plants native to that zip code, which is very interesting, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are easy to grow, readily available, good garden plants. And so if you're going to use Calscape, there's an advanced search function that has a lot more that you could put in, where you can put in your local area, but you can also put in that you want plants that are easy to grow and commonly available in nurseries. And for most of the people who are joining us in this class, that's going to give you a much more usable search list for you to start than looking up your plant information. And so the idea is that before you get to this point, you'll have thought through your general design, your functions, what you need, the layout of your space. And then you can know, okay, I need a couple of shrubs for part shade, my soil's well drained, and I have like a 5 foot deep space. So they can't be any wider than 5 feet. And you can look up the plants that are gonna fit in that category. And then you can know that as it gets farther away, closer to the path, well, there it's really full sun. You want plants that are still gonna be low water. And it'd be great if they attract butterflies to that area or something like that. And then you can really start to kind of build up your plant list from there, based on what's going to work in your yard. And then one last note for those of you who are hoping to save water in your landscape is remember that you can have low water plants and still have a high water landscape or a high water yard. We see this all the time. Remember that you also, if you have an automatic irrigation system, are going to make sure you understand that enough and water it, especially after the plants get established, as a low water landscape. Oftentimes we'll see people that will put in these plants and the sprinklers remain on like a lawn irrigation setting, and they don't really save any water, and the plants aren't healthy long-term. So we have lots of different irrigation focused workshops on our YouTube channel, and we'll be teaching them coming up in the spring as well in kind of this live online format where you can ask questions. So I'd encourage you to join us for those as well to make sure you understand that aspect of it. Oh, one thing that I forgot to talk about that we're going to talk about briefly is wildlife spaces before we get to water spaces. We're going to only cover this briefly because this really is a whole other talk, and there is a lot that will be specific to where you are coming from. For those of you in California, I'd encourage you to check out our full Gardening for Birds, Butterflies, Pollinators, and More workshop, which I will be teaching live online very soon. I think towards the beginning of next month. You can check that out on our Eventbrite page. And we also do have a recording of that on our YouTube site as well. But the basic idea is that to provide for wildlife, you can provide, oftentimes in our suburban backyards, we're really talking about birds, pollinators, butterflies, maybe lizards, and you could provide food, water, cover, and places to raise young. And that's basically trees and shrubs that they can spend time in when they don't want to be out in the open. So vegetation layers. And so to create your own wildlife nature sanctuary, you can have something that's wonderful, magical, takes a lot less water and maintenance than traditional gardens. And so things need food. Oftentimes that starts with having plants that after they flower will have seeds that birds like, or having plants that attract butterflies because caterpillars are an incredibly important food source for baby birds. A little bit of water from some bird baths or recirculating water feature, and then that shrubbery, some amount of dense shrubs, oftentimes along the edge of the yard for shelter. Birds will also stick around for nest sites, so trees and taller shrubs, nesting material. And in turn, having that diversity of native plants and those different kind of structural elements will also bring in oftentimes many good insects, like ladybugs, just as an example, that help with garden pests that eat aphids. Some of our small songbirds will eat seeds part of the year and also then eat lots of garden pests other times of the year. And one easy way to start for people who might not be ready to jump like full into a full-on habitat garden is a lot of people have either a fence or a wall around part of the edge of their yard where they don't really want to necessarily be looking at it. They'd like to be looking at plants instead. It's a great place to plant a habitat hedge, which it could just be kind of a line of shrubs that will fit into that space that will be things that you've researched that are good for habitat, whether it's birds or pollinators, and plant them maybe a little closer together than you would otherwise so that they kind of grow into each other and have a density that'll be great for birds to shelter in. And that's a really easy way to, in a very powerful way, get started with those kind of habitat features in your yard. And you don't necessarily need to have exclusively native plants in your whole yard. Here's just an example. It's an elevated bird bath, goes a long way. This is a bird bath that someone had given us. And this is like the first thing that we put out in our backyard before we planted anything, and just having a clean source of water. This is cleaned out almost every day just by tipping it and putting a hose in it, and then probably scrubbed about once a week. And it is amazing what bird life will come just for a regular clean source of water. And ours, it's actually a small-ish bird bath that we just put up on a cinder block. And my partner arranged little just leftover blocks of decomposed granite around, which also turned that into great lizard habitat. And so we have birds splashing around in it and lizards sunning themselves on it pretty much almost all the time. And then in terms of design, we intentionally placed this right where it can be seen from a sliding glass door from our bedroom and on our bed, which means that both we and our cats get to see all the action happening at the bird bath. One of my favorite ways, and most of the bird baths in our yard are actually constructed just like this, just a ceramic saucer that would be like for underneath a nice ceramic pot, but that saucer is just used as the bird bath up on, in this case, just a tree stump. It is nice to elevate them. It does give the birds more of a chance if there happens to be a stray cat hunting in the backyard. And because they know that, some birds will be more likely to visit a bird bath that's elevated. Small recirculating water features work great too. And there's different designs, and there's lots of conversion kits you can get either online or sometimes at the local hardware store. Some of them come with a little plug. They're meant to adapt for like a pot already. and they'll have a plug and the cord goes out underneath. For larger ones, like I mentioned earlier, oftentimes the places that sell them will sell the conversion kits. And they can either be self-contained within the pot, sealed at the bottom, which makes it very simple, or it can be something over a little vault that then spills over the edges. Birds like them both. And then if you are going to have a mulched garden, overall, there's a lot of advantages, but you'll want to make sure that you do leave a patch or two of bare soil. Many of our native and non-stinging pollinators are solitary or live in much smaller groups than a traditional beehive, and they live in nests in the soil. So if we cover all of our soil with mulch wall to wall, we're eliminating that habitat for them. Also, always like, if you're not worried about snakes in your particular yard, a few piles of rocks make great lizard habitat. And then a few logs or larger branches, which also are good for mulch path edging to kind of provide an end to that space. And you don't need to be too tidy all the time. A little bit of leaf litter and all that sort of stuff is great habitat for little insects, which are of little consequence to us, but very important for birds and lizards as food sources. I'm really a fan of, personally, rambunctious, oftentimes mostly annual native wildflower meadows in these little, pretty much unusable planting strips along the sidewalk. Oftentimes there'll be a few stepping stones for people to get from their cars, but lawns here are just a waste of water and resources, and the sprinklers that water them always shoot way over into the street and onto the sidewalk and are just a pain to manage. And there's sometimes not a whole lot you can do in a very narrow space, but having a combination of some small perennial native plants and then some annual wildflowers can provide a lot of habitat in an otherwise pretty much unusable space. Again, with some flagstone or some broken concrete nicely set in as stepping stones. And then let's cover water, answer a few questions, and then do our final design example. So water spaces. Probably at this point won't be surprised to hear me say we have a whole other workshop just focused on that. So if you're interested in really getting into how to design spaces to hold and capture water, have them look nice in your garden, I'd encourage you to check out our rainwater harvesting for home landscapes workshop. That will be very relevant to those of you in California. There are definitely some subtleties, both in plants and in terms of how you would build these things, because the rainy season is different. How often it rains is so different in different regions. And so there will be general information that's applicable to everyone, but that's really focused on California. For those of you in other areas, there's a lot of work that's been done by a lot of different groups, nonprofits, cities, to inform people how they can capture water at home and improve the environment while doing that. So I definitely encourage you to look up a local resource, which will have information that's really relevant to you. But overall, when water falls on your site, the kind of modern paradigm for thinking about what to do with it is to, especially coming off your roof, slow it down some, allow it to spread out some, and that will allow your landscape to sink that in some, both to have your yard function as a sponge to hold that water and make it available for the roots of your plants, and also over time to contribute to local groundwater recharge, which would traditionally have rain would fall and recharge the groundwater. But with the way that we've built our urban areas, a lot of water just drains directly out of our area. So we want to build things so that we can recapture some of that water, recharge our local groundwater, so then we can use it and rely less on imported water. And so that can start with just simply thinking about things like what used to be large concrete spaces, seeing if you can make them permeable. With pathways, lots of things that used to kind of the default would be to pour concrete can be done cheaper, can look better, and can hold on to that water. And in areas like this, Paving then often creates an issue of just standing water in a small planter or near the house, so it can more gracefully hold that water, suck that water down. Or examples of replacing downspouts with rain chains, that as the water falls, bounces off of each link in this chain, slows it down. So this would be coming from the roof gutter instead of just a metal downspout, then kind of comes through, goes out through this pot, or if there's a lot of water, it could spill over. That pot's totally optional. And then goes into a gravelly system that can hold water. It's probably a number of inches deep, and then also direct it around to a side where this is called more of a French drain, probably, rather than a dry stream bed. In narrow areas, can kind of have a trench and then fill it with a large size gravel. And then in the pore spaces in between, just the air spaces, the water can move. Usually, if the existing walkway is in good shape, you can dig right underneath it. Someone just asked me to show the rain chain again very quickly. And there's lots of different designs. You can just go online and type rain chain. Local nurseries are selling them more and more, and you can definitely find them online. And so this brings the water just passively around the edge of the house. It picks up from more downspouts as it goes, and then around to the front where there's room to have a wider infiltration area. And then, crucially, any water, if there's a huge rain event, that would be too much for the system to hold it all, then would get to overflow in the front yard, where just naturally it would travel through this mulched landscape where the yard could absorb more and out to the street, instead of what used to happen on this property, which was that water from the backyard would potentially flood the basement. And this aesthetic, I really like this very rambunctious, naturalistic aesthetic. But if that's not for you, the principles of how to deal with the water still hold true. And so the big idea is thinking about what used to be just a get it down, get it off the property, away from the house kind of default way of thinking about it, is now how can we turn this into something useful, and how can we set up our yards in a way that both look nice, but also turns this water into a resource, both immediately for our plants and to sink that water down and help environmentally overall. There's another rain chain. You can see here, a different approach, but the same concept. More a little bit of a naturalistic dry stream bed, gets wider for an area to sink in, and then if there's too much water, it can just again proceed onto the street. But even something like this landscape that we saw before, taking what used to be a slope and turning it into a series of terraced spaces, will hold a lot of that water that used to run off just in this natural mulched garden, and by using all permeable pathway materials, gravel and decomposed granite, and just looks lovely as well. And one last note, and then we're going to get to our final design example. As you start to pull together your design, remember to plan for construction. So you'll have your design, you'll be excited to go out and start buying your materials, but pause. Make sure you're considering, how are you taking this on? Whether you're building it yourself or whether you're hiring a landscaper, are you going to be able to do it all at once? Do you need to do it in phases? Are you going to do it casually on the weekends, a bit at a time when you find the time? You don't want to go out and buy 300 1-gallon plants and then having to be watering them and taking care of them and watching them get overgrown because you have months of other work to do before you're ready to plant them all. For those of you in California, plan to plant in the best season, which is going to be mid to late fall into early winter, if you can. Like right now is kind of getting towards the tail end of ideal planting season. Mid to late fall is really ideal. The plants really can get rooted in and established. And then when the next spring comes around in the heat, they're really ready to start growing. Summer is a good time for contemplating design, killing turf, preparing irrigation. Work with your budget, think about your budget, and adjust your design and phasing as necessary. If you're working with a contractor, bring them in early, talk about budget. Good landscape contractors are often pretty booked up, and so get on their schedule so that they can do the work at the ideal time of the year, if at all possible. And if you're working with a contractor, like any major project you're working on at your house, get at least 3 quotes, check references, all that stuff. Make sure you're really working with someone who's going to do a great job for something that's going to have a huge impact on your lifestyle and the way you're going to live in your house and on your property. And if you do hit limits, whether it's budget or time, try to make your limits lead to creativity rather than compromise. And don't feel like you need to get it all done at once, especially if you're doing this yourself. Don't try to take on your whole front yard or your whole backyard necessarily all at once. If this is the first time you're doing anything with plants or anything with landscape and it feels intimidating. Much better to do just a few planters or half the front yard or something like that. Kind of chunk it out into separate projects. Start small, start with something that feels manageable and build on your success rather than trying to do too much, getting halfway through the project and still feeling overwhelmed. If you get 1 or 2 small projects under your belt and you understand what it's going to take to be successful for them, then you can start to look at larger chunks of your yard, larger projects, and kind of understand from there what it's going to take, what you think you are capable of. So let's check in on a couple of questions, and then we'll do this design example that will hopefully bring it all together. Okay, mostly some personal questions. Let's just a couple that I will answer before we get into this. First one, should you call the city before you dig, or are you not digging deep enough to worry? Good question. Wherever you are, there is probably, if you're in an urban area, some sort of number you can call or website you can go to get utility information, get someone to come out and mark any buried lines. Always a good idea. In general, if you're just doing some basic landscaping, you're probably pretty safe, but you never want to find out the hard way. So around here in Southern California, there's a service called Dig Alert, and you can call them out. They'll show up within 72 hours, mark any utilities. They won't mark anything that's like your personal side. So for example, like they'll mark where the water line is in the street, but they won't mark where your water line is on your yard. They might help you find your gas line on your yard because of where it goes to like your meter is usually farther on your yard, but it is good to know, and they can often help you identify like where would it come in from the street, especially if you're in a newer development where there's a lot of buried utilities, really, really essential. And you should be calling them before you do any digging, because you never know what they'll find out. I've told people in a lot of these classes, I worked with someone who their neighbor installed a new hedge and the landscaper took out a fiber optic line that just was assuming wouldn't be there. And all of the internet went down to the whole neighborhood. So you don't want to find that out by accident. And then the other question that has come in from a number of people is gophers. What do you do about gophers? Well, I wish I had a genius solution. So yeah, thank you, Thomas. 811 is the local number for Dig Alert, but I believe in other areas, it's different numbers. So gophers are not necessarily an easy thing to deal with. There's no plants, like you'll hear about plants that gophers don't like or that drive them away. In my experience, there are certain plants like euphorbias. Most of them are euphorbia type plants that have a caustic, nasty sap. Like they maybe won't eat those, but they'll just eat the other plants. And gophers, they just don't go away by wishful thinking. So the two things that people do are trap them, which will kill them. Those traps do kill them. And that's a lot of work, but is something that does work. And then if new gophers come in, you just have to get on it right away. And over time, that can make a big difference. I never recommend using poisons for gophers because a whole number of things. The traps will kill them relatively instantly. The poisons are a terrible way to go. And a poisoned gopher will sometimes come out of the trap as it's dying and get eaten by a dog, a hawk, a coyote, depending on your area, and that poison can accumulate up the food chain or cause other issues. So I really don't recommend ever using poisons. The other thing you can try to do, which the costs will add up, but if you're just not going to trap gophers, is you can buy gopher cages online. There's different companies that sell them. They kind of look like a chicken wire, but instead of building each one out of chicken wire, which takes a lot of time and is kind of the wire is sharp, they ship flat, and you just open them up and kind of fold the corners underneath. And so you can plant your plants in gopher cages. They do sometimes make the roots circle and not kind of grow out in the totally natural way that they would otherwise. Perennial plants, smaller plants, shrubs tend to do just fine. If it's really going to be a large canopy tree over time, I would not recommend planting it in a gopher cage because what I've seen from some trees that I've planted in gopher cages that were dug up later is it can impact the roots for a large tree in a way that I would worry about stability for something like an oak tree over time. But smaller plants should not be an issue. And the gophers will still come around. They might still eat some of the roots. It's not going to solve the issue completely, but it will really give the plants a chance to get established. And then Lorna typed in that she put up an owl nesting box, and now the owl gets them. So that's great. I've seen a lot of properties where things like that help, and they're great for the ecology as well. But maybe there's still enough where the problem still exists. So it's going to be site specific, but thank you very much. That's awesome to hear that that's working for you with the owl box. And then I saw someone raise their hand. Please type into the chat or the Q&A, please, instead of raising hands. We just have too many participants to really manage the raising hands and having individual people talk. Okay, so with that, we're going to do this example and then plenty of time to answer questions at the end, and I'll get to as many individual questions as I can. So for this, I wanted to show a pretty simple, not high budget project. And so this is the backyard of the place that my partner and I used to rent in Altadena, California, right above Pasadena, kind of hot inland Southern California, on a property that's 7,500 square feet. So not small, but not super huge either. If you want another example and one that's also going to focus a little bit more on plants, also definitely check out our California native garden design class. And we go through a slightly different but very similar process. And it's of the front yard of the place I currently live right now. And so here is our backyard in December 2016. We had just moved in. Landlord, when she was trying to get the place rented, had someone come and tear out all the weeds, but you can see things just starting to come back now. And there's lots of weeds growing very quickly, and a bunch of fruit trees, which was awesome to have. And she basically said, don't kill the fruit trees, do whatever else you want. And then a bit of a broken concrete path going through the yard, and some sprinklers, but not a very good sprinkler system. You can see there was an attempt at a raised bed vegetable garden in between two fruit trees, and so not nearly enough sun, and so that had been abandoned. Space for a grill, and a couple of funky old structures, which we were definitely going to keep in use. And so this was March 2016. We had recently moved in, just got the stuff on the inside settled, lots of our potted plant collection and other various garden junk. We had a lot of potted plants because before this, we didn't have as much space to garden in the ground. And then this little back patio space that had this picket surround because the previous tenants had a small dog that they mostly kept in this space. Nice avocado tree. Not great form, actually had some issues, but it was nice to have an avocado tree. And so this is the aerial photograph of the space. I use Google Maps or Google Earth quite a bit for the aerial photography. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's kind of disconcerting how good of aerial imagery you can get of pretty much any property, but as a design tool, really useful. So north is here. So we have this zone on the north side of the house, and then this is a sunroom and a brick patio. So we had this north side that was pretty shady. Big crepe myrtle tree and some palm trees here. So that was pretty shady there. And then fruit trees, which by the time we actually got there, there was more canopy. This is mostly part shade through here. Sunny spot in the back. Detached garage going down slope from the street as you go here. It's just another angle so you can get a good idea of the space. And so here is basically, to break it down on one slide, an 11-step system for do-it-yourself design. Always starting, again, going back to setting your goals. Step 2, investigating your site. And you'll see a lot of these have a star, and that star is actually kind of constant, but this is where it's most important. Constantly revisit step 1. So you're going to set your goals, and then take a walk around and investigate your site. And, that might take some time. It might not be just once. If you just move to the property, always, before you do your redesign, be there for at least one good rain event, see what happens. Sometimes there's a lot more water accumulating different places than you'd expect. And as you're investigating your site and walking around, always remember your goals. I mean, literally have them written down and walk around. Maybe some of your goals will change. Maybe you'll have new ones. Keep a written list. Look at the opportunities presented and the constraints presented by your existing site. We'll give you some good ideas, or sometimes we'll maybe make you think, well, maybe I can't have a 2-story hot tub on a deck. Number 4, create a list of physical features that you're going to want and the activities that are going to happen there. Do you want a big patio space? Do you not? Do you need a fire pit? Do you not? Do you want a grill plus a bunch of counter space for a great outdoor kitchen? Are you really going to use that? If not, maybe you don't need it. So create that list and think about all of that. With an idea of your goals, having looked at your site carefully, your opportunities and constraints, and your list of those other physical features you're going to want, then it's time to do some research. Let it be fun and inspiring. Research plants, research features, create a folder on your computer with images of different patio spaces if you're doing that you like, things like that. Think about budget. Creating a folder on your computer of images of things that resonate with what you are going to be wanting is going to be so useful. Whether you're doing the work yourself, being a guide for you, then also like looking up, there's lots of DIY YouTube videos about how to do so much in your yard. Or if you're working with a contractor, the most useful thing you can do for a contractor is give them specifics. So telling them I want a patio over here versus I want a patio that looks a lot like this is going to be really useful. So do that research, organize what you want. And then going on, organize the features that you will have in your landscape. Where are you going to want those different things? Think about them in terms of priority. What's going to be the most important thing? Will be something that you really, really want to make sure you get in the right space. And permanence. It's a lot easier to move a bird bath than it is an oak tree or a brick patio, for example. Then on paper, roughly diagram their locations. Where are things all going to lay out? when you're roughly diagramming things, it's really easy to do multiple versions of it, change it all around, go through lots of different examples quickly, decide which one you want. And then I would encourage you to then refine it by putting it all, drawing it out on what's called to scale on graph paper. So that would be basically measuring all of the important measurements on your site, your house, the yard around it. You can use to get rough measurements on Google Maps. If you bring up your site on the Google Maps website, your address, and zoom in, you can click on a box that will have it be an aerial photograph, and then you can right click with your mouse and actually do measurements. It's useful. It's not as good as like real measuring tape measurements, but it might get you close enough if you're not going to do measuring tape measurements. But measure it all out if you're willing to, if you'll put the time in, and then draw it out on graph paper, where either one square on the graph paper will be 1 foot or maybe 2 feet. For the typical suburban yard in our area, what works out really well is buying an 11 inch by 17 inch size pad of graph paper, which is sometimes hard to find locally. If you have a good art supply store, they'll probably have it. You might need to order it online. And then 1/8 of an inch on that would equal 1 foot, would normally cover a full front or backyard. And so sometimes you can get graph paper with 1/8 inch little squares. The typical graph paper is a 1/4 inch square. And so if 1/8 of an inch equals 1 foot on that, then every square would be 2 feet in each direction. And then you can draw things out quite accurately, really accurately, actually. If you live in an area with much smaller front yards and backyards, sometimes you can have one square be 1 foot. So you could figure out what's going to work for you. The advantage of that is it really lets you figure out your quantities of materials you need to buy, and especially your plant counts. And we'll look at a couple of examples for that and one other guide that goes into that a little bit more. We're currently working on an online guide for exactly how to draw that out. It's just not ready yet. Sign up for the newsletter and you'll find out when it is. And then, so after getting all of that basic stuff down on graph paper, not figuring out individual plants yet, but basically where everything is going to go, all your functional spaces, then you can choose and place your plants using whatever resources are available to you. And then finally, at a certain point, you're just going to have to get your materials, go ahead and do it, maybe in different phases, but put it in. And then again, remember, a garden is never truly done. So from there, you'll enjoy it, but also evaluate, reassess. Seasonally, you might tweak things, then reassess again, repeat it, and have it be a fun and educational experience. So let's design it. So just basically looking at that aerial photograph that I showed you on a white piece of paper, not worrying about it being to scale at all yet, I drew this out. This is actually the, I think, 3rd or 4th version of it. The first couple, like the sizes were way off. And it doesn't need to be perfect, but just throw those away. It's fine. When you finally get one, don't draw anything else on top of it. Either scan it or make a bunch of photocopies of it, but you don't want to, every time you have a new idea or want to change things, have to redraw your base drawing. So do something that you'll be saving it, or oftentimes, I did it differently here because I was scanning it and having it be digital. But if you have that, good idea to photocopy it or scan it just so you have it. But you can start working with sheets of tracing paper on top of it. Tracing paper is really useful because then you can have a bunch of different ideas and kind of compare them and take the best from each. Really useful to work with tracing paper in this process. And so this is basically it. The house, north is on the right on this side. You can see where the main trees are. Sunroom are a couple of funky little shade structures, the garage, driveway, and then parking space here, just a little bit of landscape space in the front yard. And so here were our goals. Wildlife habitat, nice place to be. Grow as much of our own food as possible to hold, we thought we could probably figure out a way to hold all of the water that falls on the property, house, driveway, and everything on the property, let it soak in. Place to eat outdoors, place to read outdoors, place to cook outdoors, And then within habitat, birds, beneficial insects, and lizards, a place to compost. And then also we happen to live in a very noisy neighborhood. And so we wanted something to dampen the noise. And so then from there, going into site analysis, which is just a fancy way of saying really putting down what we observe in a formal way so that we can make sure we take it into account when we do our design. So observe for as long as it's going to take. Really, the important things are sun and shade patterns, part sun, full shade, soil and drainage that we talked about earlier, views, both views off of your property, like do you have a good view of the mountains that you want to make sure you don't put a tree in the way of? Maybe the tree should be off to the side then. Or are there views onto your property from your neighbor's second story balcony that you want to obscure with putting a tree that will block it over time? Water flows. Where does the water flow? Is there a lot of it? Does it flood areas? Does it need to be addressed? Can it be turned into more of a resource? All that sort of stuff. Any particular microclimates, particularly hot or particularly cold areas, like is there a section that's in between an asphalt driveway and a cinder block wall that gets full western afternoon sun in Southern California? That's going to be an even hotter area than the rest of your yard. Maybe that's an area for desert plants that are really just soak in that heat and respond with flowers in the summer instead of being upset with that amount of heat. Noise or other neighbor issues, if there's anything. Those views, existing plants that you might want to keep, plants that you need to remove, etc. In Southern California, we often see beautiful, mature, but medium water use plants that people will rip out the lawn and put in a very dry garden with the best of intentions, and then all of a sudden the tree's not doing well and they're surprised. So if you have a big medium water use tree like a magnolia, maybe that's an area that you're going to work with drip irrigation and make sure you continue to provide water for that specific tree when everything else goes drier. And there are going to be plants that can transition between drier and more medium water use areas that you can do your research and find out the ones that'll be happy grouped there. And then are there other places that naturally you use and that you don't? Like, for example, your neighbor's really noisy AC compressor is right on the other side of your fence somewhere. It's not going to be the place to put your new patio, most likely, if you want to be out there at the time where your neighbor is running their air conditioner. And so this is the basic site analysis for this property. And it's not very complicated. All of our soil drained pretty well. Sun was going to be our really important thing because there was a lot of part shade or complete shade from all of the fruit trees and the few larger trees. And so we really wanted to make sure that we mapped our full sun. We had just morning sun in this one little open patch here. Okay sun in this patch over here. These are all north side, so lots of shade here, lots of shade here. And then the best sun happened to be in this big, large paved area in the driveway. And then I'll also mark with blue arrows where water is flowing off the house here, off the garage. All this driveway water went this way. And because it was coming down here, the garage would often flood, we realized after we moved in. And it looked like the water wanted to go this way, but the soil had built up a little bit over time here. So it couldn't quite get out. And this was kind of a little swimming pool area. Chain link fence over here, wood fence over here and back here. And lots of noise, mostly coming from this side. And then on this side, there's just some weird vibes coming from this neighbor, to be honest. And there was just a chain link fence right here. So sometimes that neighbor would be just out in her driveway. It's kind of standing there. And if we were on our patio, because her driveway came in through here, it was like she was right there with us. So maybe we wanted some more privacy there. And so that's it, not rocket science, but getting it down on paper so we can very intentionally have our design respond to all of our observations as we are thinking about how to achieve our goals. And so from there, really started sketching out our plan of where to do what. It's complicated to look at the whole thing, so we'll zoom into the backyard because that's where most of the plan was happening. And so for our goals, our hardest thing to place was going to be where to have our veggie growing areas for growing our food because sun was at a premium and you really want full sun for that. And so we realized we only had a couple of good spots for it, really. This sunnier spot right here. And then we just decided we're going to build raised beds right on the driveway because that's our best spot. And then for a few things that could take some shade, like some salad greens and things, we figured we can get one raised bed in here. And then we're also going to build a raised bed right on this patio because we had good sun. So we're just building them tall right on top of the pavement. And then we had a spot in here where we can put some potted herbs right outside. Our kitchen back door was right here. So that'd be perfect for a little kitchen garden, just in terms of the convenient place as well. So we can run out, harvest something right in the middle of cooking. For the water, we realized we could capture all the water on the site because it mostly drains onto the site. But the one thing we wanted to do is we dug out some of this extra soil here. So a lot of this water could go down this way and then absorb in this final area, this wide area in the back where we just had some shrubs. It became our compost area as well. Shady, which is a great place for compost in Southern California and hot climates, and just kind of around the back where we don't need to see it all the time. Became a storage area as well. And then the one thing we asked our landlord to do, which would protect her property as well, is we just asked her if she can just put a rain gutter on this one section of the garage, then we can take that water and have that go out into an area that had fruit trees, and that we turned into a meadow. Because as we were thinking about our habitat, we realized also, we didn't have a wide enough space because we had all these fruit trees, which was great to have like our habitat area over there and our orchard with just mulch underneath, which is pretty typical over here. We had to combine it all. And so what we decided to do is to work with California native meadow plants underneath the fruit trees that would then be both compatible with the every other week watering that we were giving these fruit trees, and could take this extra water from the garage when it rained and would still provide lots of habitat benefits. And then just in little sunnier spots where these ends are, those were our little random shaped sunnier areas where we can fit 1 or 2 or 3 of our favorite full sun, smaller California native plants to enhance that habitat. We went as far in this phase as saying like this would be the spot for the bird bath, the BB, because from the sunroom where our cats would sit, they can see right out along it. And then further in the house, it would be a spot where we can see walking down the hallway. There was just a really nice alignment and we'd catch the birds in their action. We decided that here on the north side where it's shady and there wasn't as much that we can do with the planting here would be a good spot for the grill, not too far from the kitchen. And so this funky shade structure would be the place where we can set up a table and eat. And then we wanted a space to read. So that was a nice space to be farther back, more kind of isolated in the quiet spot of the garage. And then we'd set up a recirculating water feature here so that we can have that dampening of the noise of the neighborhood in the whole backyard. And then along this fence, partially wood, but partially the chain link area, we would set up that habitat hedge that I mentioned earlier, both for privacy and for the habitat value. And so, didn't need to be a creative genius, just looking at the site, looking at our goals, and then messing around with a few examples and iterations of how we can fit everything in, making sure everything made sense next to everything else, and going from there. And so we'll go just a couple minutes after noon to just show examples of how it grew in. For those of you who want to draw it out to scale on graph paper, there's a good example funded by the LA Department of Water and Power of a free PDF book you can download produced by a company called G3. And I just created a quick link to where you can be redirected to it because it was a very long URL. So if you go cbwcd.org/G3book, cbwcd.org/G3book, you can download that automatically. And they have an area talking about the site plan. Again, here they say 1/4 of an inch equals a foot as a basic to start with, which would be true for smaller properties. But for larger suburban properties, I would go with 11 by 17 graph paper, probably 1/8 of an inch equals a foot. And they even walk through thinking about holding on to that rainfall and then drawing out your plants. And so to wrap it up, here's the design plus the work and just about a year. And then we'll look at some pictures from year 2. So that's March 2016, and that's a year later. You can see the same trees. And so we, in doing all of that, realigned the path. Here's some of the sunnier spots where the California natives could go. Here is our fruit trees looking at the young meadow underneath the orchard. Our recirculating water feature with some native water plants. We just found this trough in the backyard. Someone had tried to grow vegetables in it, but didn't realize they would have needed to have drained holes in the bottom for drainage. So we we dug out the soil, just got a cheap, like $25 fountain pump from the hardware store, and it worked very well. Got some mosquito fish for free from our local vector control district, and they kept all the mosquitoes away and have lived for many, many years, continue to do so. So here's the, again, we didn't have a big budget for this. Some old, not very great furniture, but it works. And little potted plant collection. Our bird bath, just made from some extra 4x4 wood and ceramic dish. Show this because this is a wreath my partner made, and again, not being too clean. It's that little bit of spider web, and we'd see hummingbirds harvesting the spider web because they use it to stitch together their nests, which make them elastic, and they can expand over time as their chicks grow. So that's really interesting to see. It's a combination of perennials and annual native wildflowers. You can see the edge of our vegetable garden built on the concrete there. California coffeeberry, one of our main shrubs for our habitat hedge. And then the existing fruit trees. You can see just tucking our little temporary nursery area under a fruit tree, part shade. So this is the vegetable garden in the back in our sunny spot. And then at the edges, so this was on drip irrigation, its own, for a long time, we just ran it off a hose and then eventually put in its own valve for that. And then at the edges, some native plants that you just water with a hose every once in a while. And then eventually they got roots, especially here, just into the edge of it where we weren't watering them directly, but they didn't need any additional watering. They just got it from the ambient moisture around. Back path along it. Our compost area. And then we planted some cuttings of edible cactus that eventually would grow in taller and kind of visually separate the space as well. Here's our driveway vegetable garden, just building the raised beds tall so they'd have enough drainage out the bottom. Worked very well. We could take advantage of that sun. And some of the combinations of native plants growing in. The part shade in this shade structure, using it both for our nursery area for starting new vegetable seeds and to house our collection of native dudleyas, which don't like full sun. One of our California native succulents. And this was just, bit at a time as we found the time doing the work ourselves. So here you can see transition. We had planted our native coyote brush, which you can barely see, to grow in. And then not wanting to open it too much, just slowly removing this tangle of other vegetation mixed up in the fence as we gain more privacy. So there's always was something going on, and the garden was never finished. You can see here, cords just coming out the back of the water feature and along an extension cord. We know where it is, so it's covered by the mulch, but we're not going to dig through it. Pollinators would come, and they're very comfortable landing on the rocks to get the moisture without getting swept in. And you can see our garden at 2 years, our shade meadow garden starting to grow in. Some interesting native plants that don't work in full sun in Southern California, taking advantage of that shade. You can see here our other habitat hedge with coffeeberry in the back and deergrass in the front, starting to grow in. On the north side, near the grill, working with yarrow. It's one of our native plants that can take the combination of shade a lot of the year and then full blasting sun in the summer on the north side of the building. And different flowers in the native meadow. We did eventually negotiate with our landlord to remove a couple of fruit trees that weren't very productive and plant a few new ones with some native wildflowers to bring in the pollinators. And so in the end, we get to harvest from our veggie garden and then take a few steps and grill them on the grill. And then just a few other steps through that same garden and enjoy them here at our outdoor dining table, right next to our bird bath. but just having everything be in a great convenient location with plants that fit really well, or sit here on our patio looking down, enjoying coffee in the morning, or some drinks using nicely flavored native herbs that my partner is great at making drinks with in the afternoon. And remember, it's not like one of those magazines in the middle of the summer. Things might look a little bit more tired, but because we built part shade and utilized the part shade of the trees, still pretty nice place to be. But it changes throughout the seasons and it's not always fresh and perky. And that's just very normal. But remember, it's more fun if you consider your garden never truly done. You're always enjoying and noticing new things. And from there, making some little changes and seeing what happens. So what's next is, for wherever you are, remember to plan the best time of the year. For us in California, spend the summer planning, learning, designing, killing turf. Early fall is often doing other site work, getting your irrigation done, and then planting the best time of the year. Or if you're all dirt and really ready to go, hurrying up and figuring this all out and planting if you're confident that you can have the time to do that. And use this along with all our other workshops online and our online resources. And so for those of you who are interested, I will just leave this up for the next few minutes, and then I'll put up a slide with some of our other links to our online resources. But here's kind of the order of things. And so what I'm going to do right now is I will launch our just very, very quick closing poll, where you can let us know, if this workshop worked for you. We always really like to get feedback from how we're doing. And in addition, we're still relatively new to trying to teach this kind of complicated information online in this format. So if there are things that worked for you well, please let us know in the chat. If there are things that weren't clear, I know it's a lot to cover, and we kind of try to do our best balancing covering everything we feel like we need to cover versus how in depth we can do it. So if there are things that weren't clear or didn't work, please let us know in the chat. Yeah, we'd just love to get any more specifics from anybody about your thoughts about how the workshop was, other than what we can get in just these questions in the poll. So as you're filling that out, briefly, all sites are going to be different, but here is the order that most people would use in their landscape, starting with their goals, their site observations, their budget, and their design. If you're working with contractors, having that conversation really early. For those of you in an area of California where there's turf replacement applications, you have to normally do that before you do any work. In the summer, killing your turf, preparing your soil, doing all of that, getting your irrigation system work out of the way so it can support your plants right away. Sometimes if you're doing drip irrigation, you'll do all of the valves, pipes, everything like that. Then you plant late fall, early winter. Final irrigation system work right after that, mulch cleanup and final touches, and then your establishment care and enjoying watching your garden grow in. For those of you who are also kind of thinking, okay, then from design, where do I go? I'd encourage you to check out on our YouTube channel. We have installation and establishment of California native and water-wise gardens. So where we don't really focus on design, but we focus on how do you actually get it into the ground. And then for those of you who have like an old turf irrigation system and are wondering how do you set it up to water a garden like this, we also have a retrofitting turf irrigation systems for water-wise and native gardens class. And so with that, I will put up just the main links that I had mentioned throughout the class. And I will start answering questions. So I am just going to start at the most recent ones and move backwards just because that's the most manageable way of doing it. And I'm also just going to check to make sure people who have individual questions are still here. And again, yeah, definitely would love to know in the chat how people's experience with this workshop was, and if there's anything that was particularly helpful or unclear. Okay, so from Bebe, B-E-B-E, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. My yard slants to the home and continues to the yard. What kind of plants are best to capture the water? So in general, the plants themselves aren't going to directly capture the water, but what you are going to want to do is do something in the landscape. Might be digging a small dry stream bed, might be using something like that French drain we showed to hold on to some of that water. Make sure you're holding it or capturing it, not right up against the foundation of your house. And then where you're going to be creating that concentrated wetter area, then you're going to want to work with plants that don't need a ton of water throughout the year and can tolerate that water when it's available. So like for California yards, oftentimes right along that area that would capture that water, yarrow is a popular choice of a plant that works, as well as some of the what are called sedges, grass-like plants, as well as some of the juncus. So like gray rush is one that is commonly used and works well. We do have, if you're in California, we do have on that Inland Valley Garden Planner website, under the helpful lists, there is a list of plants that we recommend growing around and even in those features that capture water. And then in terms of how to design that and set it up, I'd encourage you to check out our Rainwater Harvesting for Home Landscapes workshop online, which we taught recently. I actually have a similar issue in the front yard of the place where I live now. And so we actually really use my current home as an example because we had lots of issues with water, of how to turn that problem of flooding into a resource and integrate that into the garden. Okay, so moving on to Elgin. I have a small 20 square foot highly visible space. I would like a suggestion for a specimen tree, something as showy as a Japanese maple or something. Please type back into the Q&A or the chat as I'm answering the next question, where you live. And that will help me hopefully make a recommendation, because it'll be very different based on where you live. Okay, so gophers. Let's see. From Christine, can I recommend any consultants in the Pasadena area? So I can't recommend individual consultants because we are a public agency. It's very tricky. However, I can recommend some places that might be able to recommend. So Pasadena, you are in a great place for learning about native plants because you are right between two nonprofits dedicated to it. Theodore Payne Foundation in Sun Valley, it's Theodore Payne Foundation, and also the California Botanic Garden in Claremont. If you're interested in native plants, those both would be places that should probably be able to share with you some of the contractors that are picking up plants from them, because they both have nurseries all the time. And I believe they have lists of consultants and designers that you could work with. Also, for anyone in Southern California, general Los Angeles area, at that cbwcd.org/resources page, where on Monday, all of the slides of this are going to be posted in a PDF. There is also a file that's our local landscape suppliers list. And so you can often call nurseries that sell those sorts of plants, and they might have people they can recommend as well. And so there's a lot of nurseries on that list that sell these sorts of plants that we're talking about. Okay. Oh, someone asked me to put it back to the Order of Things website, or the Order of Things page. There we go. We'll leave that up for a while. That was an easy one. Okay. Don't worry, for those of you who had issues with the post-class survey, don't worry about it. Not a big deal. There's not really a way that I could relaunch it. That's just fine. From Sharon, is a yarrow lawn easier to maintain than Carapia? Probably going to be about the same. The yarrow might be a little bit higher maintenance if you mow it less often, because those big, beautiful flowers, if you let the yarrow lawn really flower, those big, beautiful flowers, when they dry out on the stems, can be a little bit woodier. I mean, I have a section that would almost be considered like a very small yarrow lawn. I kind of do it by hand with a very sharp, like manual hedge trimmer. You can do it with a decent power string trimmer as well. But I wouldn't call it easier to maintain. They both creep pretty aggressively at the edges over time. Carapia faster than the yarrow, but the yarrow will be kind of slow and steady. So I would recommend kind of like a decent edging and barrier at the edge of either of them. Yeah, they're probably, I would say, about similar overall in terms of maintenance. Personally, I prefer the yarrow aesthetically, and it has more habitat benefit. So that's one of the reasons why I like it. From Judy, what size is the paper on which I drew my rough plan? I don't really remember. I think I just grabbed something out of the copy room at the office that I work out of. That might have been legal sized paper, but my standard when I do drawing is I'll use 11 by 17 paper. If I'm trying to draw like a whole site without getting really crazy with like poster size paper, it just gives you a lot more room to work with. Okay, at what point would I do the soil drainage test? And then any specific steps in identifying sun and shade? Sure. So the drainage test, I do that like right at the beginning, just to know ahead of time what I'm looking at. Like the drainage is not going to change, so you might as well do that pretty early on, as soon as you know what parts of your yard you're really thinking about. Because then you never know. Maybe you'll just hear or come across someone talking about a plant and you'll want to look it up, and then you can just know it's going to be something that'll work for you or not. And then remember, for kind of more in-depth coverage of the drainage test, check out the I can't remember the exact name, something about choosing, purchasing, and planting California native and water-wise plants workshop that we recently put up online, where we talk more and show kind of picture by picture a drainage test process. And then recommendations on identifying sun and shade. I guess one thing would be, it's easier if you've been in a place over time. Full sun, again, is 6 or more hours of direct sunlight throughout most of the year. Anything that's less than that is kind of considered part shade. At least in Southern California, full shade should really be things that don't really get any direct sunlight, because some of the plants that want full shade, even if they get just for a few hours of the day, like a direct beam of sunlight, can really suffer. Whereas the plants that can take part shade can kind of take that, just not that all day. And then just kind of one thing on the north side of the house is like specific part shade, where if there's nothing overhead, but on the north side of a house or a building, because in the winter and a little bit in the spring and the fall, the sun is farther in the south side pretty much most of the day. And then in the summer, it's like directly overhead. You go from shade a lot of the year to pretty close to full sun in the summer. And there's not a ton of plants that will really deal with that. If you are dealing with local kind of Southern California situations, if you're closer to the coast or coastal influenced weather, it's more flexible. If you're inland, here are some of the plants that I found work well for me. And I'll just type them into the chat so people can find them. For that kind of directly on the north side of the house, for shrubs, my favorite plants are Toyon for larger, coffeeberry, Those would be kind of my largest shrubs, or some of the currants for shrubs that will lose their leaves part of the year, but in the spring have spell correct is messing with that. They'll lose their leaves, but in the spring they're just so lovely. So for the larger shrubs, for the medium-sized shrubs, my favorite is probably creeping Oregon grape. And then for ground cover is yarrow and woodland strawberry are my two go-tos on the north side. And those really can make a lovely planting on the north side of a building. And even though some of them aren't really full sun plants, they seem to do pretty well for me between the eave of the house and just the way houses are shaped, where they're normally, even if it's full sun in the summer, it's not full sun all day. They do quite well over the summer, but quite well in the shade the rest of the year. So those are some kind of go-tos. I know someone else had asked that. Okay, from Yvonne, how do I get rid of weeds in my front yard? Ooh, that is a whole other class, Yvonne, but we have a class that goes into a lot of that. For me, my main go-to will be a process called sheet mulching, which is using either sheets, rolls of painter's paper, but better yet, like corrugated cardboard, just old boxes of things, using those as a temporary biodegradable weed barrier, laying them down and putting wood chip mulch on top of it, kind of smothers the weeds. And after about a year or so, it'll just biodegrade and be gone. So it doesn't have the long-term issues of like the plastic kind of woven fabric weed barriers, but usually is long enough to smother the weeds. And if it continues to be mulched, keeps the weed seeds from getting to the sun for kind of in perpetuity. Nothing's like a complete, magical cure. There's always some weeding to do with the garden, but that's my main go-to and is pretty effective. The best thing would be to check out our online workshop on our YouTube page for removing your lawn the right way. And even if you don't have a lawn, the techniques with the sheet mulching as my go-to are applicable for just kind of weedy areas as well. Usually it's just a little bit easier to deal with the weedy areas or than compared to like a full thatchy lawn. Other question, are there different kinds of mulch? Yes, there are. We also have a whole workshop about that called Compost and Mulch for Water-Wise Gardens. That workshop, if you're not interested in compost, starts with the mulch part, and we go through, again, the wood chip mulch, the gravel mulch, and the wood chip mulch, the gravel mulch, and the decomposed granite mulch. And within that show, different types of wood chip mulch, different sources, different sizes of gravel, different types, talk about the advantages and disadvantages. So someone asked for that YouTube link. So that's on the screen right now. All of our past workshop recordings, so the other ones I'm referring to, are at cbwcd.org/YouTube. That will redirect you directly into our playlist with our past workshops. Okay, next question. When I plant fruit trees in the front yard, also are citrus trees available to buy right now? Depends on, it all depends on you, and all depends on your goals and also your neighborhood. I have definitely, I don't have fruit trees in my front yard where I am right now. Definitely have in the past. Planted fruit trees when I redid the front yard at my parents' house because that was their best place for them because of their small backyard. We only had room for one additional fruit tree back there. Yeah, just up to you. If you like the look, which I don't mind the look, and the space is right, that's fine. And also depends on your neighborhood. I would say in most cases, plan on some of your fruit disappearing from your fruit trees if you put them in the front yard. I've had places where I've lived or we've had fruit trees in the front yard where all the fruit disappears. And I've had places like my parents' house where some of it does, but my parents still get enough that it was useful to put the fruit trees in anyways. So yeah, just depends. And then citrus trees, yeah, in a lot of Southern California, because of the quarantine, you can't buy citrus trees right now. I will not get into right now whether or not it makes sense to plant citrus trees because of that. If you want kind of more discussion about that and the Wong Long Bing disease affecting citrus, then we have a Fruit Trees for Home Gardens focused on Southern California workshop available on our YouTube channel. And it just depends. Some areas are within that quarantine zone, some areas are outside of it. So like right now where I am, Glendora happens to be the only place where you can sell fruit trees, because it's like sell citrus trees. Sorry, all the other fruit trees can be sold, but it's the only place where you can sell citrus trees in the local area. But there are plenty of other good fruit trees to plant. And so if you want to learn about some of my favorites and ones that are easy to grow in our hot Mediterranean climate, you can check out that Fruit Trees for Home Gardens landscape. Also, Cecilia typed in the Master Gardeners, LA County Master Gardeners do have, and I think the San Bernardino ones as well, have been doing a lot of work recommending alternatives to citrus trees. Okay, from Karen, will the water capture class help me deal with patio flooding that I can't identify the source of the water? Unfortunately, no. You kind of need to figure out the source of your water, and then you can figure out what to deal with it. But until you find the source, you're going to be not really knowing how to appropriately respond. Might be worth trying to call someone out like during or directly after a rain. That's a tough one. Check if it's coming from below, or if there's a drain in your patio that's supposed to drain water out and something has clogged somewhere else on it, water might actually be coming up and out of the drain instead. Those would be my first guesses, but yeah, you're going to really want to figure out where that's coming from first. Okay, so more gopher talk, which we've covered. From Maria, would the Inland Valley Garden Planner work in San Antonio, Texas? What I would say is I wouldn't use the Inland Valley Garden Planner to select your plants, because some of the plants will work in San Antonio, Texas, and some of them will not work in San Antonio, Texas. So I would use other sources to figure out what's going to work in San Antonio, Texas. Once you know what plants you're thinking about, some of them we will have information entries for in the Inland Valley Garden Planner. And so for those plants, like once you know that that plant will work well in San Antonio, the information about the size, probably the flower season, the maintenance, all of that will work in San Antonio. But the other ones might not. And also, good suggestion, my partner, because I'm working from home today, is sitting in the next room and is hearing every word I am saying and being very patient with me as I've been talking for a long time. Just sent me a text message reminding me that the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, which is based in Austin, has a great online plant database and will definitely have lots of information that is relevant to all of you Texas gardeners. So thank you, Kira. Okay. So from May, question of the north-facing bed that we talked about earlier. I think all of the plants that I mentioned that are my favorites for north-facing will work in Sacramento area. You might just want to double check, but also the California Native Plant Society for the whole state is based in Sacramento, and I think there's a pretty active local chapter as well. So you can probably find some good local Sacramento resources as well. Also, some people have typed some stuff into the chat. Cecilia has typed in a link for some other San Antonio plants, and as well, a little bit further up, she typed in the link. Oh, those were coming just to me, Cecilia, instead of to panelists and participants. So I'm going to repost some links that Cecilia typed in. For those of you who are trying to those of you who might be trying to chat with everybody, there's a little tab, and make sure you're welcome to have things seen by everybody, but make sure that that you have selected to send it to, oh, the links are, copying the links is not working. Make sure you have it selected to send it to everybody. Let's see, here we go. Okay, so for alternatives to citrus, that Celia posted, I just put up the link there. And for the San Antonio plants one, I just reposted it as well in the chat. Thank you very much. Okay. Oh, and then someone else shared San Antonio Botanic Garden. Awesome. Okay, so back to the, okay, so someone, in terms of termites in mulch, someone had typed in earlier. So I've not had in dry Southern California termite and mulch issues for wood chip mulch, but someone did type in that in Florida, with that moisture, they can be a problem for those of you who are Florida gardeners. Said it was mostly pine and cypress mulch that they had experienced the problems with. For Lucy, we have 4 beautiful blue whitish pots around the pool that we want to use. Are native plants a possibility to use for planting? Yes, you can definitely plant native plants in pots. You will want to make sure that you select ones that are going to do well in pots. Theodore Payne Foundation, their website, theodorepayne.org. I believe they have a native plants in pots specific like handout you can download. You can also use the Inland Valley Garden Planner in the searchable database. I believe you can both click plants for pots and native plants and get some ideas. And then also, just in the last couple of days, sometime this week, the LA Times had an article in their plant section about planting native plants in pots. So few resources available for you for that. From Francesca, would deer grass grow below a pepper tree? I think you have a pretty good chance, as long as it's an area, like if the pepper tree is pruned up enough that there is, like it gets sun, then yeah, deer grass doesn't want to grow in full shade. But I have had good luck overall with grasses as something that will grow underneath pepper tree. If it is shady, a smaller grass-like plant that I've used quite a lot is Berkeley sedge, also called foothill sedge, which is smaller than deer grass. And then I have used deer grass near, not pepper trees, but other very tough trees with lots of roots taking up soil space. And it does deal well with root competition. And the pepper tree has some chemical kind of stuff going on, but the grasses do seem to do pretty well overall. But again, for deer grass, you're going to want a decent amount of sun. If it's pretty shady, I would stick with grasses that can take shade. Okay, from Garrett, how deep should a decomposed walkway be? Normally, it'll be about 3 inches of decomposed granite. And the normal edging that's used is about 4 inches. So you're able to get that edging down into the dirt a little bit more. Sometimes like a real commercial style decomposed granite walkway that goes in, and kind of like best practices would be to put down like 3 inches of compacted road base or like angular gravel, and then 3 inches of decomposed granite. But oftentimes people will either just compact the ground the best they can and then do decomposed granite, or for just a residential walkway, maybe like 1 inch or 2 of gravel and 1 inch or 2 of decomposed granite. And in the workshop recording of the installation and establishment of native and waterwise gardens, I do believe we look at some little kind of like cross-section diagrams of decomposed granite in gravel walkways. Okay. Cindy, I have a neighbor's, let's see if Cindy's still with us. Cindy is still with us. I have a neighbor's giant tree that drops leaves, then flowers, then berries that germinate. What can I put on the ground to prevent little plants growing? Good question. So there's no necessarily perfect solution. If it is currently just soil, then certainly a thick layer of mulch will help somewhat, because less of the berries will get down into correct soil contact, but some of them will still be able to germinate in the mulch, most likely, depending on what they are. Gravel could help some, but gravel is going to be a pain to clean all the leaves and berries off of. So maybe a thick layer of wood chip mulch could help. And then also just potentially having some sort of ground cover covering the soil would mean that those seeds would have less access to the sun. Less of them would germinate. It'll make the ones that do germinate a little bit more difficult to pull out because the access won't be as good. So there's no perfect answer, but those are some thoughts. Okay. From Ash Butcher, how best to deal with squirrels with veggie gardens? So yeah, sometimes squirrels are more or less a problem with veggie gardens, just depending on things. It's almost a whole other conversation, but I feel your pain. I've had to deal with that before. A mixture of protecting things and adapting. So like, for example, I don't have squirrels in our veggie gardens, but we've built a lot of really rich organic soil. And we have what I'm pretty sure are skunks that come through, and they'll dig through the veggie garden just looking for grubs and earthworms. And if we have young seedlings, they will cause quite a bit of damage. And so if the squirrels are digging and that's an issue, just finding some way to make it not as easy for them to dig there would be something. What works really well for us is when things are really young, we will take like nursery flats, like where you might, like that might carry like 16 individual of those square small 4-inch pots. And we have a bunch of those just from buying plants over the years. Some of them have a really tight plastic on the bottom where not a lot of sun gets through, but some of them are a little bit looser. And we put those like upside down just over areas that we've seeded, and then things just don't dig in that area. As things grow in, or sometimes during the day so they can get more sun, we'll remove them. But overnight, we put them down. We've had yards where like raccoons dig a lot as well. And sometimes we've used like prunings that are thorny, like from roses and bougainvillea, and just kind of lay them where they're not going to be away in the garden bed. And it doesn't actually injure the critters, but they just know that it's not going to be a good place to go in and dig. And so they'll do less of it. And somewhat it's just dealing with what's going to work. So for example, I've had yards, a lot of yards, where if you grow big, juicy, like beefsteak tomatoes, they're just irresistible. All of that moisture in the middle of summer, they're just going to get most of them. But in the same yard, if you grow really delicious cherry tomatoes, like they'll get a few of them, but you'll still have plenty to harvest yourself. And so just kind of dealing with that with your crops. Like I don't even grow corn because it's a pain to grow. You have to grow a certain amount of it, and it tends to attract a lot of ants and aphids in a lot of Southern California gardens. But that's one example where I had a garden where we were growing a lot of different stuff, and we would never be able to harvest corn. Right before it's ripe, the squirrels would get every single one. So part of sustainable gardening is just picking your battles. And then a couple of people typed in some other examples, marigold, someone else with forks with tines that look like scarecrows. If those work for people, that's great. In most of my experience, if your garden is really getting raided, that really won't make the difference. And squirrels are actually surprisingly smart. Like something that scares them for a day, by the time you get like a week or two later, they'll habituate to it really quickly and be right back in your garden. Might depend on where you are in the particular squirrels. Okay, Judy has a long question, which I'm happy to answer. Let's just make sure she still is with us. Judy is
not with us anymore on the webinar, so I will skip that one. See, payola. We're digging part of our backyard and found a huge rock over 100 pounds on the edge where our small retaining wall would go. We can't get it out. What do you suggest? Could you put some ground cover with shallow roots over that rock? No. Part of sustainable gardening is respecting what's already on your site that needs to be respected. So I can't quite picture where is the rock buried? I mean, if the rock is buried in over 6 inches of soil, you can try some sort of small ground cover planted from a 4-inch pot. But if the rock is, okay, yeah, it is buried. So if there's at least 6 inches of soil on top of it, you can try a small ground cover. Succulents, if a succulent would make sense there, tend to do well with, as long as the soil will drain around that rock, will tend to do well without, even in hot areas. They just don't need a ton of soil depth. Could work. Or, even if it's a large rock, maybe thinking about a shrub that's going to have some width to it, being on either side of that rock or on one side of the rock where the branches and the width of the plant over time will grow over it. The roots themselves, as long as it's in a pocket of soil next to the rock, it's not going to be a problem if on one side there's a little bit less access for the roots to grow than the other side. I wouldn't necessarily plant like a tree that's going to get a lot of wind that the roots that need to anchor it will grow in. But for a shrub or like a smalling large ground cover, you can plant next to it, and then the branches could grow, over that space to occupy that space. Let's see, from Paola said, what does size class mean? I'm not sure what that refers to. If you retype in to either the chat or the Q&A with more specifics of context, I might have said that, but I can't quite picture the context right now, and I'd be happy to answer. Let's see. Is Christina still with us? Christina, yes. I'm going to take a sip of water, and then let's answer Christina's question. Okay. I see mulch used a lot in native gardens. I have 2 large trees that dump leaves, branches, blossom, seed pods, and other tree trash year-round, which would completely cover the mulch. Can I use this as mulch? And if so, what could I do so it doesn't look so trashy? I'm not sure what kind of tree you have, but certainly you can use it as mulch. That's basically what mulch is. But that's just going to be the naturalistic look that you're looking for. So there's not it probably wouldn't, you're either going to like it or you're not going to like it. And some of that is just up to your aesthetic. I tend to try really hard just to accept what's going to fall. I wouldn't bother putting additional wood chip mulch underneath that tree. It's probably, if it jumps that much, it's going to want to be leaf litter. Because it doesn't make sense to be raking things out. Still, in our demonstration garden at the Waterwise Community Center, we have a couple of huge old sycamore trees, and I'm all about keeping leaf litter on the site, but they would just bury the whole garden. So some of it can stay, but a lot of it does have to be raked up and then reprocessed through green waste, just because it would bury everything with the amount of it. And so if that's the case, that's okay. If you're using some of it and want the area to look nicer, then carefully combining it with plants. Oftentimes I'll go with grasses that can take part shade under an area with a lot of leaf drop, or even certain just kind of looser branched shrubs, so that they don't capture a lot of leaves. The leaves can kind of fall through, and maybe some rocks or something like that, and then just accepting some of the leaf litter. But it's tough. So much of it's a personal aesthetic. Let's see. From Vanessa, what's your thought of planting flowers or just ground covering under trees? Depends on the tree, depends on the amount of leaf litter. I tend to like, even if it's going to be more open and just some of the leaf litter or mulch, I tend to like, if it's shady, still like a little bit of planting here or there. Like for California, I'll often go with the Berkeley sedge or foothill sedge, a little bit here or there. It doesn't need a lot of water, just kind of greens up the space some, or that creeping Oregon grape, where they can take some leaf litter, even if they get buried a little bit for a couple of days after like a storm and don't get cleaned off right away. They're adapted to that, and they just green up the space some, even if it's not like a blanket underneath the tree, which can be very hard to maintain sometimes. Okay. Let's see, Christina is no longer here. Let's see, is Carla? Carla is still with us. What kind of grasses do you recommend that are not invasive and don't spread with rhizomes or seeds? So if you are going for a like low turf grass, all the recommended lower water, low turf grasses pretty much spread by rhizomes or roots. That's just the truth. That's what it is. If you're talking about larger bunch grasses, like ornamental grasses, then I would definitely go with considering California native deer grass. In most yards, it doesn't spread by seeds aggressively. I have had like we have one section of our garden at work where it just loves the combination of soil and how it gets watered there, and it comes up all over the place. But I've like never had that happen in other gardens. So can't guarantee it won't come up from seed, but it is rarely an issue, or native deer grass. And then the other one for smaller, that Berkeley sedge or foothill sedge, which will be about no more than 3 feet wide. And Southern California really likes at least partial shade. And that one is a clumping. So some sedges, which are grass-like plants, spread, a lot of them do. That Berkeley or foothill sedge is a clumping one. So it's individual plants. And I don't think I've ever noticed it like self-propagating in a garden where I've grown it. I've grown it some places in more full sun, and it's really tough. I have a lot of that in my parents' garden, which gets some full sun. It just kind of turns a little bit yellow golden in the summer and then greens right back up as it cools off. Okay, moving on. Okay, Lewis is no longer with us. Going back through, making sure people are still here. Covered that question. Let's see. Jim is no longer here. Maybe we're getting through. Okay, so that's all the older ones. So now I'm going to go back to the ones that have just kind of come in the last little bit. It's from Carla. What would be my favorite native plants to go around a fountain, full sun, low height? If there's any little bit of water splash coming from it, my favorite go-to is yarrow, because it doesn't need a lot of water, but it will take that. Stays low, beautiful flower, ferny kind of foliage, does spread a little bit. Also ones, if there's not a ton of water, but kind of favorites would be Margarita Bop Penstemon, red buckwheat, and if there's, depending on how low needs to be, it can be something like knee-high, De la Mina, 3 words, De la Mina, Spanish, verbena would be some of my favorites that I would consider. Okay. From Deborah. I threw a Haas avocado seed into my vegetable garden in my front yard. It is now 10 feet high, but small stalk. What should I do with it as it has not created any avocados? Will the roots grow under my house? Depends how far it is from your house. I mean, if you never prune an avocado tree, it'll get like 35 feet tall and up to 40 feet wide in 80 years, but you hardly see them that large in the urban landscape. Seedlings are really unpredictable. You don't know, it won't grow an exact Haas avocado. Might be close to a Haas, might not be close to a Haas, might be many years until you find out. And some of them need a second avocado to fruit well at all. So if you don't plant another avocado, you might not ever get any, but it's also tricky because I don't really have time to get into it, but the matching avocado to make it fruit needs to have certain different characteristics as well. So normally people, if they really want an avocado tree, they'll go to the nursery and buy one so they know the exact fruit that they're going to get. You just don't know what you're going to get with that or if you'll ever get fruit. That's just kind of the genetics of how it all works. From Cecilia, what do I think about chip drop as a source of wood chips? So chip drop is an online service you can sign up for, basically telling local tree trimmers who might be working in your area that, yeah, you can take wood chips when they have them, that you'd like them. So what do I think about chip drop? Definitely check out all the information on their website. They're very upfront about the quality that you should expect and also the quantity, because you're going to need to be able to get like a lot of wood chips. They want to dump their whole huge truckload. That being said, I've never used it myself because I have other sources from local tree trimmers for wood chips, just that I have over time. But we've talked about it in our workshops, and I had someone in the last workshop that I taught chat in and say that she's used it since then. And she had a great experience she needed a lot of wood chips, but had a great experience being able to pretty quickly get a lot of wood chips. So definitely look at all their resources online that they have about it. But if you need a lot of wood chips, yeah, I know at least one person who's had a good experience. I know some people that they even show on their website, some people, this is not what they were looking for and they weren't happy. So make sure it's going to work for you. If I didn't have access to the specific source of wood chips that I have right now, and I needed like a full truckload, I certainly would probably sign up for it because I'm not too picky about what my mulch looks like. And to get like a full arborist truck of wood chips delivered to your house would actually add up for that 40 yards and could end up, which might be, that could end up being like $600+ if you're just buying mulch, which is not something that I would want to spend money on. Personally. Okay, from Sharon. Yeah, so Jorge typed in, I've used chip drop, easy peasy, but a ton of work spreading it. Yeah, because they're going to bring a lot. I mean, I have half of in my driveway right now, the equivalent of like what a smaller size chip drop load would have probably been. And this has probably been our yard for like at least 2, maybe 3 weeks now. And my partner and I are just like chipping. It's in our driveway and we're just kind of chipping away at it a little bit at a time. So don't plan on spreading it all in a weekend. It's going to have to be somewhere where it can kind of sit for a while and your neighbors are going to be fine on it. Okay. From Sharon, my queen palm often drops tons of fruit. Do I have to worry about what to plant below it? So in the design example that we showed, we actually had 2 queen palms in the front yard that dropped a lot of fruit. So I have some experience with that. From the individual fruit drop, probably you don't need to worry about it that much. Those, if like you have shrubs or grasses, those will kind of fall to the ground and you can clean them up every once in a while. The one thing that you are going to want to take into account is like making sure you plant kind of tough plants, because most people with queen palms, every once in a while, they'll cut off like the whole dried bunches of fruit. And those will often like come crashing to the ground or have to remove some of the lower leaves with a pole saw. And so physically getting in there to do that work. And then also the queen palms have, close to the queen palm, they have a very tough fibrous root system. And so that's pretty aggressive. It's kind of
new plants tend to grow slowly, and you'll want to plant really tough plants that can take some root competition. If it's a lot of times it's still pretty much full sun underneath queen palms, you might think about, among other things, working with some of the nice ornamental larger bunch grasses, because that way, if something drops on it, you can kind of just fluff the grass back up. You're not going to be breaking a bunch of branches. If someone kind of needs to wade through the area to do some work, grasses are easy to work around versus some of the other smaller shrubs that maybe would like break branches and things. Really tiny little perennial plants, going to be hard to deal with the root competition from the queen palm. Fortunately, queen palms are very tough, and I've seen them do pretty well as you move towards water-wise landscapes under and around them. Okay, let's see. Any tree/branch shredders you could recommend? Any ones that are battery operated rather than gas? I was thinking about buying the Greenworks shredder. I don't use small tree or branch shredders. I know someone who is really into composting who has a small gas powered one. The electric ones, I mean, those things need to be really powerful. I mean, certainly they'd be better for the environment. I really don't know. Most of them are pretty limited on the size of what you can put into it. I'll oftentimes, for my prunings, to just reuse them as mulch for my smaller prunings, I'll just kind of kind of just slice them up with my pruners a little bit at a time as I go, or sometimes use small branches and like edging along paths, and then other stuff that I can't use, I'll put into the green waste, which works for my suburban yard. The other thing to be very aware about if you're going to use a small shredder is they are dangerous. Wood shredders are dangerous machines. If you use them responsibly, you should be fine, but it's not something to be used lightly. And yeah, just learn about all the safety involved in doing it. Okay. From Lycia. Can you plant a tree next to a patio, or would you recommend a bush that can be shaped into a tree? You can certainly plant a tree next to a patio or a large bush that could be shaped into a tree. Either way, depending on what size you want. Oftentimes people want like a small, maybe 25 to no more than 30-foot tree next to a patio, or even smaller, or that bush size. Like an oak tree next to a patio over time would just drop like a lot of oak leaves. So you wouldn't even need a paved patio. It'd just be great to have a bench underneath an oak tree, underneath the mulch. But yeah, any of that should be fine. You don't necessarily want to plant like a huge ash tree, but most of the time, like with a concrete patio, the breaking of like the pavement is trees planted like right at the edge where there's not going to be physically the space for the tree to grow. And usually those trees aren't watered as the tree wants to be watered, which is infrequently and deeply to train the roots to go down. A lot of times those trees have been growing in lawn, which all the moisture is in the top 3 inches of soil. And then that just encourages the roots to stay close to the top. And then that's when you have those aerial roots. And so for most people, for a patio, just on the western side, but give it a few feet away. Don't plant it like a foot about the edge. Maybe plant it for a small tree, 3-4 feet. For an oak tree, I'd do it at least like 5 or 6 for a larger tree. And yeah, that should be, and then it just depends on the tree. If you're really worried about it, then you can always stick with a large shrub that you prune up into a tree, at least put it on the west side. And if you don't get overhead shade, then you'll get at least like afternoon shade when the sun is in the west, if you're really, really worried about the concrete. Okay, I think that's it
Thank you very much. We ended up doing a full hour of question and answer with some really good questions, and a lot of you stayed. Hope you learned some useful information today. And please sign up for our newsletter if you don't already get it, and join us for our future workshops. We normally do workshops like this at least twice a month, if not more often. And so enjoy thinking about your yard through, I guess, a new perspective, and good luck on your design projects, and have a good rest of your weekend, everybody.